Not every chapter of history reaches a satisfying conclusion. Some leave behind unsettling evidence, fractured timelines, and discoveries that continue to unsettle seasoned experts decades later. From silent chambers to baffling artifacts and unexplained disappearances, each case blurs the boundary between documented fact and enduring uncertainty. So sit back, relax, and let's uncover 3 hours of history's most chilling mysteries. Morning mist settles over the eastern Nile Delta, where fertile marshes merge with winding waterways and the distant outline of ancient settlements fades into the horizon. Broken walls, weathered pottery, and fragments of temples rest beneath layers of soil, preserving the memory of a remarkable turning point in Egyptian history. At first glance, the landscape appears quiet, yet it witnessed the arrival of rulers whose origins and rapid ascent continue to inspire debate thousands of years later. The Hyksos emerged during a period when Egypt's central authority had weakened. Around the 17th century BC, they established control over large parts of northern Egypt and ruled from the city of Avaris. Egyptian records written after their reign describe them as foreign kings who seized power during an age of instability. Archaeology, however, paints a more gradual picture. Rather than a sudden invasion, evidence suggests that people from southern Canaan had been settling in the delta for generations, bringing their customs, languages, and trade networks with them. If that was the case, how did a community of migrants become the rulers of one of the world's greatest civilizations? Excavations at Avaris reveal homes, workshops, imported goods, and burial customs unlike those traditionally associated with Egyptian society. Horses, advanced bronze weapons, and new styles of military equipment became increasingly visible during this period. The Hyksos are often linked to the introduction of the horse-drawn chariot into Egypt, although historians continue to debate exactly how and when this technology spread. Whatever the answer, their reign clearly marked a period of significant cultural exchange rather than complete isolation. Ancient Egyptian texts portray the Hyksos as unwelcome outsiders whose rule disrupted the natural order. Yet those accounts were written after native Egyptian kings reclaimed control of the country. Victorious rulers often reshape history in their favor, emphasizing triumph while diminishing the complexity of earlier events. Could these descriptions reflect political propaganda as much as historical reality? Another mystery surrounds the Hyksos themselves. Their royal names combine influences from multiple cultures, and many of their religious practices blended local Egyptian traditions with beliefs carried from neighboring regions. Instead of erasing Egyptian customs, they adopted many of them while introducing their own. This mixture raises an intriguing possibility. Were the Hyksos conquerors, ambitious immigrants, or simply one chapter in Egypt's long tradition of cultural interaction? Some researchers have explored more unconventional ideas. A few have proposed that the speed of the Hyksos' rise points to an exceptionally organized network of merchants, diplomats, and military leaders operating long before they openly claimed power. Others wonder whether important written records describing their administration have simply not survived, leaving modern historians to reconstruct an incomplete story from scattered fragments. There are even suggestions that later Egyptian rulers deliberately destroyed evidence connected to the Hyksos in an effort to erase an uncomfortable period from collective memory. While no decisive proof confirms these possibilities, the absence of complete records continues to encourage careful speculation. Today, the ruins of Avaris remain silent, offering only pieces of a much larger puzzle. Every inscription, every buried foundation, and every newly uncovered artifact adds another detail while leaving fresh uncertainties behind. The Hyksos transformed Egyptian history, yet their true path to power remains only partially illuminated. Perhaps the ground beneath the delta still conceals evidence capable of changing the story once again, waiting patiently for someone to uncover what has remained hidden for nearly 4,000 years. If the Hyksos remind us that history can conceal the true origins of powerful rulers, another Egyptian mystery reveals how even entire destinations can fade into uncertainty. This time, the puzzle does not begin with a throne or a battlefield, but with a voyage, one that promised immense wealth, yet ultimately disappeared into the shadows of time. Along the walls of Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, delicate carvings still preserve a remarkable story. Ships with towering masts glide across calm waters. Sailors unload fragrant resins, polished ebony, ivory, gold, exotic animals, and living myrrh trees carefully prepared for transport back to Egypt. The scenes are filled with astonishing detail, capturing one of the most ambitious trading expeditions ever recorded in the ancient world. Yet despite the precision of these reliefs, one essential fact remains frustratingly absent. Where was the legendary land of Punt? For the ancient Egyptians, Punt was far more than a trading partner. It was often described as a place blessed with extraordinary abundance, where rare materials could be gathered in quantities impossible to find along the Nile. Incense used in sacred rituals, precious woods, animal skins, monkeys, baboons, and aromatic plants all arrived from this distant land. Egyptian texts even referred to Punt as God's land, a phrase that has inspired centuries of debate. The expedition organized during Hatshepsut's reign around the 15th century BC stands among the best documented. Reliefs portray not only the ships and cargo, but also the people who greeted the Egyptians. Their homes stand elevated on wooden stilts above the ground. Palm trees surround the settlement, while nearby hills suggest a rugged coastline. One local ruler and his family are shown welcoming the visitors, creating what appears to be an unusually peaceful diplomatic encounter. These artistic details have become invaluable clues. Many archaeologists believe Punt was located somewhere along the western coast of the Red Sea, possibly within parts of present-day Eritrea, Sudan, Djibouti, or Somalia. Botanical studies of myrrh and frankincense trees support this general region, while analyses of baboon remains brought to Egypt have pointed toward parts of northeastern Africa. Scientific techniques, including isotope testing, have gradually narrowed the possibilities, but none has produced a location accepted beyond dispute. Why would such an important trading partner remain so difficult to identify? One explanation lies in the nature of Egyptian records themselves. Ancient scribes focused primarily on celebrating successful expeditions rather than producing navigational guides. Distances were rarely measured with precision, and landmarks that seemed obvious to Egyptian sailors may no longer exist or may have changed dramatically over thousands of years. Coastlines shift, rivers alter their courses, and once thriving ports can disappear beneath layers of sediment. Another possibility is that Punt was never a single kingdom at all. Some historians suggest the name may have referred to a broader trading network stretching across several coastal communities rather than one fixed destination. Egyptian ships could have visited multiple ports while recording them collectively under a single name. Such an arrangement would explain why descriptions of Punt appear both consistent and surprisingly flexible across different periods of Egyptian history. Other theories venture further from conventional scholarship. A small number of researchers have proposed that Punt may have been located far beyond the Red Sea, perhaps connected to distant maritime routes extending deep into the Indian Ocean. Supporters point to the remarkable sailing abilities demonstrated by Egyptian expeditions and argue that ancient seafarers may have traveled farther than traditionally believed. Others speculate that the location of Punt was intentionally protected as a closely guarded commercial secret, known only to elite navigators whose knowledge disappeared with time. There are even suggestions that later generations gradually transformed a real destination into something almost mythical. As memories faded and direct contact became less frequent, stories of Punt may have blended fact with reverence, allowing the land to occupy a unique place between geography and legend. Such transformations are not uncommon in history, where extraordinary places often become increasingly mysterious with every passing century. The temple reliefs continue to raise subtle questions of their own. Every carved ship, carefully illustrated tree, and detailed portrait reflects first-hand observation rather than pure imagination. The artists clearly intended to document a genuine expedition, yet they left behind no map, no unmistakable coordinates, and no final answer that modern historians can confidently follow. Today, visitors standing before these ancient carvings see more than scenes of commerce. They witness fragments of a journey whose destination remains just beyond certainty. Somewhere beyond the familiar horizons of the ancient Egyptian world, the land of Punt once flourished in reality, or perhaps in a form history has yet to recognize. Until new evidence emerges from forgotten coastlines or buried harbors, the route followed by Hatshepsut's ships remains one of antiquity's most enduring maritime mysteries, quietly inviting us to wonder whether the greatest discovery is still waiting beneath the sands or hidden along an overlooked shore. The unanswered fate of the Minoans reminds us that civilizations are not the only things capable of disappearing. Sometimes, history attempts to erase a single individual instead. In ancient Egypt, one remarkable ruler did not simply fade from memory. Someone deliberately worked to remove her name, her image, and even the record of her achievements. Yet despite those efforts, fragments of her story refused to remain buried. Along the western bank of the Nile, towering limestone cliffs rise above the elegant terraces of Deir el-Bahari. Carved directly into the landscape stands one of Egypt's most breathtaking monuments. Long colonnades stretch toward the desert, while carefully crafted reliefs still preserve scenes of religious ceremonies, monumental construction projects, and ambitious expeditions to distant lands. Time has weathered the stone, but another force has left marks that seem even more deliberate. Faces have been chiseled away. Royal cartouches have been cut from the walls. Statues lie shattered, their identities intentionally concealed. These scars belong to Queen Hatshepsut. Ascending to power during the 15th century BC, Hatshepsut became one of Egypt's most successful rulers. Although she initially served as regent for the young Thutmose III, she eventually assumed the full title of pharaoh. Her reign brought political stability, economic prosperity, and an ambitious program of construction that transformed the Egyptian landscape. Temples were restored, monuments rose across the kingdom, and trade expanded through carefully organized expeditions, including the famous journey to the land of Punt. To reinforce her authority, Hatshepsut adopted many traditional symbols of kingship. Official statues often portrayed her wearing the royal headdress and ceremonial false beard associated with male pharaohs. Rather than rejecting established customs, she adapted them, presenting herself according to conventions that Egyptians already recognized as symbols of legitimate rule. For many years, her government appears to have functioned effectively. Then, something changed. Several decades after her death, evidence began to appear that someone had undertaken a systematic campaign against her memory. Her names were removed from monuments. Images were broken or hidden. Statues were buried in carefully prepared pits rather than simply discarded. In official king lists compiled later, her reign was frequently omitted altogether, as though it had never existed. Why would such a successful ruler be deliberately erased? The traditional explanation points toward politics. By the time these alterations were carried out, Thutmose III had become one of Egypt's greatest military leaders. Some historians suggest that removing Hatshepsut from official records strengthened the appearance of an uninterrupted line of male succession, reinforcing the legitimacy of future rulers. From this perspective, the destruction reflected political necessity rather than personal hostility. Yet the evidence introduces unexpected complications. Detailed examination of damaged monuments indicates that many remained untouched for years before the campaign against her memory began. If revenge had been the primary motive, why wait so long? Furthermore, not every image of Hatshepsut was destroyed. Some survived in remote temples, hidden chambers, or less visible locations. Others appear to have been overlooked entirely. These inconsistencies have encouraged alternative interpretations. Some Egyptologists argue that the campaign may not have targeted Hatshepsut herself, but rather the unprecedented nature of her kingship. Later officials may have wished to discourage future claims by anyone outside the traditional line of succession, using her reign as an example that would gradually disappear from public memory. In this view, the effort was directed toward preserving political stability rather than rewriting personal history. Others have wondered whether practical considerations influenced the destruction. Royal monuments contained valuable stone that could be reused in later construction projects. Removing names while recycling statues may have served both economic and political purposes simultaneously. Ancient builders were often remarkably efficient, and monuments regularly changed hands as dynasties rose and fell. More speculative ideas continue to attract attention as well. Some researchers have questioned whether important records connected to Hatshepsut's reign remain undiscovered beneath temple foundations or inside unopened tombs. Others suggest that influential court officials may have played a larger role in reshaping her legacy than later pharaohs themselves, quietly altering history while leaving few traces of their own involvement. Without complete written evidence, these possibilities remain impossible to confirm or dismiss with certainty. The rediscovery of Hatshepsut's mummy added another chapter to the mystery. For generations, the location of her remains was uncertain. Only through careful archaeological investigation, medical imaging, and comparisons involving royal artifacts did researchers gradually build a compelling case for her identification. Even in death, she seemed determined to resist disappearance, emerging once more from centuries of uncertainty. Today, visitors walking through Deir el-Bahari can still see the deliberate marks left by ancient chisels. Every missing face and erased inscription tells two stories at once. One speaks of an extraordinary ruler whose accomplishments shaped Egypt during a remarkable period of prosperity. The other belongs to those who later tried to silence her memory forever. Yet despite their efforts, enough fragments endured to challenge that silence. Perhaps somewhere within an unopened chamber, an overlooked inscription, or a forgotten archive, another piece of Hatshepsut's true legacy still waits to be found, quietly preserving answers that history has not yet revealed. As the echoes of that mystery begin to fade, another story emerges from the silent stones of ancient Egypt. A mystery not of disappearance, but of deliberate erasure. Sometimes the greatest secrets are not buried by time alone. Sometimes they are carefully removed by human hands. The cliffs of Deir el-Bahari rise from the western bank of the Nile like immense natural walls, glowing gold beneath the desert sun. Nestled against these towering limestone formations stands one of the most elegant monuments ever built in ancient Egypt. Long terraces, graceful colonnades, and carefully carved reliefs seem almost untouched by the passage of thousands of years. At first glance, the temple appears to celebrate the triumphs of a powerful ruler. Yet a closer look reveals something unsettling. Faces have been chiseled away. Names have vanished. Entire images have been methodically erased, leaving behind smooth patches of stone where history once spoke clearly. These missing pieces all point toward one remarkable figure: Queen Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt around the 15th century BC during the 18th dynasty. Unlike most royal women before her, she did not remain simply the wife or mother of a king. Instead, she declared herself pharaoh, adopting many of the traditional symbols of kingship. Statues portrayed her wearing the royal headdress and the ceremonial false beard usually associated with male rulers. Official inscriptions referred to her with titles reserved for kings, while artists blended masculine and feminine features into her image. Her reign was, by nearly every historical measure, successful. Egypt experienced prosperity. Ambitious construction projects transformed the landscape, and trade expeditions brought valuable goods from distant lands. Among the most famous was the expedition to the mysterious land of Punt, whose exact location remains debated today. Reliefs inside her temple vividly depict exotic trees, rare animals, and foreign merchants returning with treasures that enriched the kingdom. Yet centuries later, something extraordinary happened. Much of Hatshepsut's legacy began to disappear. Her statues were smashed. Her cartouches were carved away. Her likeness was removed from monuments she herself had commissioned. For generations, historians wondered why. The most widely accepted explanation centers on her successor, Thutmose III. Although he had ruled alongside Hatshepsut for part of her reign, many scholars believe that decades after her death, he ordered the systematic removal of her memory. According to this view, the goal may not have been personal revenge, but political stability. By eliminating the memory of a woman who ruled as pharaoh, later rulers could reinforce the traditional line of male succession and prevent future challenges to royal authority. Interestingly, the destruction was not immediate. Evidence suggests that many of the alterations occurred roughly 20 years after Hatshepsut's death. This delay has puzzled researchers. If resentment had driven the campaign, why wait so long? Was the decision motivated by changing political circumstances rather than lingering anger? Other historians have proposed different possibilities. Perhaps the erasures formed part of a larger effort to reshape Egypt's royal genealogy. Ancient Egyptian kings often emphasized continuity and legitimacy, carefully crafting historical narratives that strengthened their claims to power. Removing Hatshepsut from official records may have simplified an otherwise complicated succession. Still, some details remain difficult to explain. Not every image of Hatshepsut was destroyed. Some inscriptions survived untouched. Certain statues were not shattered but carefully buried, almost as though someone wished to hide them rather than destroy them completely. Was this simply a practical method of disposing of monuments, or did it reflect a lingering respect for the former ruler, despite official efforts to erase her? These unanswered questions have inspired more speculative theories over the years. Some suggest that powerful religious disputes may have unfolded behind the scenes, leaving traces too subtle for surviving records to reveal. Others wonder whether conflicts within the royal court extended far beyond what ancient inscriptions were willing to admit. A few even speculate that lost documents, perhaps stored in libraries long vanished beneath desert sands, could completely transform our understanding of Hatshepsut's reign if they were ever discovered. There are also those who point to the remarkable precision of the erasures themselves. The workers responsible often removed only her royal titles while leaving surrounding artwork largely intact. Such selective destruction suggests careful planning rather than uncontrolled vandalism. Every missing face, every erased name, appears almost surgical, as though someone sought not to destroy history entirely, but to rewrite it. Ironically, the campaign nearly succeeded. For centuries, later generations knew little of Hatshepsut. It was only through archaeological discoveries in the 19th and 20th centuries that her story slowly returned to light. Broken statues were reconstructed, faded inscriptions were deciphered. Fragments scattered across temples and tombs gradually revealed the outline of a ruler history had nearly forgotten. Yet even today, significant gaps remain. Ancient Egypt left countless monuments, but not every voice survived the centuries. When one of its greatest rulers could be so thoroughly erased and only partially recovered, it raises an unsettling possibility. How many other chapters of history have vanished so completely that we no longer realize they ever existed? And beneath the sands that still conceal untold ruins, what forgotten names may yet be waiting to emerge once more? Just as Queen Hatshepsut's legacy survived despite deliberate attempts to erase it, another chapter of the ancient world presents an even deeper mystery. This time, it is not the memory of a single ruler that faded, but an entire kingdom. Once recognized by powerful empires, Arzawa occupied an important place on the political map of the Late Bronze Age. Then, almost without warning, it slipped into silence. Rolling hills stretch across western Anatolia, where fertile valleys descend toward the Aegean coastline. Scattered among forests and rocky ridges lie weathered foundations, broken pottery, and forgotten burial grounds hidden beneath centuries of earth. Unlike the towering monuments of Egypt or the massive fortifications of the Hittites, these remains offer few obvious clues. The landscape appears peaceful today, yet somewhere within these hills stood one of the most influential kingdoms of its age. That kingdom was Arzawa. Known primarily through Hittite records, Egyptian diplomatic correspondence, and scattered archaeological discoveries, Arzawa emerged as a formidable regional power during the 2nd millennium BC. It occupied territory believed to have covered parts of western Anatolia, controlling valuable trade routes that connected inland kingdoms with the Aegean world. Its rulers negotiated with neighboring states, challenged expanding empires, and occasionally stood as rivals to the mighty Hittite kingdom itself. For a time, Arzawa commanded enough influence to be treated as a serious political force. Clay tablets recovered from the Hittite capital preserved diplomatic exchanges between kings, revealing alliances, negotiations, and military campaigns involving Arzawa. The famous Amarna letters also mention its rulers, placing the kingdom within the broader network of international diplomacy that linked Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. These documents leave little doubt that Arzawa was real, powerful, and deeply involved in the affairs of the ancient Near East. Yet, a remarkable question remains unanswered. Where was its capital? Despite decades of archaeological investigation, no site has been universally accepted as the royal center of Arzawa. Several locations have been proposed, each supported by fragments of evidence, but none has produced the definitive discoveries expected from the heart of a kingdom that once influenced international politics. Royal palaces, administrative archives, and monumental inscriptions remain elusive. How can a kingdom so prominent in written history leave behind such an uncertain physical footprint? One explanation lies in the changing political landscape of the Late Bronze Age. Around the 14th century BC, the Hittites launched successful military campaigns against Arzawa, eventually defeating its rulers and dividing its territory into smaller client states. Administrative centers may have been abandoned, repurposed, or intentionally dismantled as new governments established control. Over time, generations built new settlements above older ones, gradually obscuring the original foundations. Natural processes may also have contributed to the mystery. Western Anatolia is shaped by earthquakes, shifting river systems, and continuous human occupation spanning thousands of years. Ancient cities can disappear beneath layers of sediment or become incorporated into later communities, making them extraordinarily difficult to identify. A royal capital constructed primarily with mud brick rather than stone could gradually dissolve into the surrounding landscape, leaving only subtle traces for archaeologists to detect. Language presents another obstacle. Although scholars generally associate Arzawa with the Luwian-speaking peoples of Anatolia, relatively few inscriptions from the kingdom itself have survived. Most surviving information comes from neighboring civilizations describing Arzawa from their own perspectives. This imbalance creates an incomplete picture, where victories, conflicts, and diplomacy are recorded, but the kingdom's own voice remains largely absent. Without its own archives, much of Arzawa's identity must be reconstructed indirectly. Some researchers have proposed that the kingdom's political structure may have been more decentralized than traditionally imagined. Instead of one dominant capital, Arzawa may have functioned through several important regional centers connected by alliances and shared leadership. Such an arrangement would help explain why no single archaeological site has clearly emerged as the unmistakable royal seat. Others explore more speculative possibilities. A few suggest that important ruins connected to Arzawa remain hidden beneath modern towns or farmland, inaccessible to excavation. Others wonder whether undiscovered archives similar to the Hittite clay tablet collections are still buried somewhere in western Anatolia, preserving official records capable of transforming current understanding overnight. Every excavation season introduces new evidence, yet the decisive discovery continues to remain out of reach. The disappearance of Arzawa also coincides with the broader instability that affected much of the eastern Mediterranean near the end of the Bronze Age. Kingdoms collapsed, trade networks fractured, and long-established political systems unraveled across vast regions. Whether Arzawa's fate was simply one part of this wider transformation or the result of unique local events remains an open question. Today, the valleys where Arzawa once flourished reveal little to passing travelers. The winds move through ancient hills as they have for thousands of years, carrying no obvious memory of the diplomats, merchants, and kings who once shaped the course of regional history. Somewhere beneath fields, forests, or forgotten ruins, the true center of this vanished kingdom may still rest undisturbed. Until those hidden stones are uncovered, Arzawa remains a civilization known with confidence through ancient words, yet seen only faintly through the scattered echoes it left behind. As the story of Avaris fades into the quiet marshes of the Nile Delta, another mystery waits farther north on the windswept plateau of Anatolia. Here, towering stone gates and thousands of preserved clay tablets have allowed historians to reconstruct much of the Hittite Empire with remarkable detail. Yet even among these extraordinary records, one shadow refuses to disappear. Again and again, members of the royal family met sudden and often unexplained ends, leaving behind a history marked as much by silence as by triumph. Morning light washes over the ruins of Hatshepsut, the ancient Hittite capital. Enormous limestone blocks form gateways that have endured for more than 3,000 years, while fragments of temples and royal buildings lie scattered across the hillsides. Beneath collapsed walls, archaeologists uncovered an immense archive of clay tablets, each preserving official decrees, diplomatic letters, treaties, and royal prayers. Together, they offer one of the clearest windows into any Bronze Age civilization. Yet despite this wealth of information, the personal tragedies within the royal household remain surprisingly difficult to explain. The Hittite Empire emerged as one of the great powers of the ancient Near East during the 2nd millennium BC. Its kings negotiated with Egypt, challenged rival kingdoms, and governed a vast territory extending across much of Anatolia and northern Syria. Stability, however, often proved fragile. Behind the formal ceremonies and carefully written treaties stood a royal court where succession could become dangerously uncertain. One of the earliest examples involves King Mursili I, remembered for leading a bold military campaign that reached the city of Babylon. His victory secured lasting fame, but his return home ended in violence. Ancient records indicate that he was assassinated by close relatives, including his brother-in-law Hantili, who then claimed the throne. Rather than restoring order, the murder opened the door to further instability. Over the following generations, disputed successions, political rivalries, and sudden changes in leadership became recurring features of Hittite history. The pattern appears often enough to raise an unsettling question. Were these isolated struggles for power, or signs of a deeper crisis hidden within the royal family. Centuries later, another wave of tragedy struck under very different circumstances. King Suppiluliuma I transformed the Hittite kingdom into an empire through military success and skilled diplomacy. Yet shortly after his greatest victories, disaster arrived in a form no army could defeat. Ancient texts describe a devastating epidemic spreading throughout the kingdom. Many historians believe the disease was introduced by prisoners captured during campaigns against Egyptian-controlled territories. Whatever its origin, the consequences were catastrophic. Suppiluliuma himself died during the outbreak. His son and successor, Arnuwanda II, ruled only briefly before succumbing to the same illness. The epidemic continued for years, affecting the royal household as well as the wider population. The surviving tablets preserve deeply personal prayers written by King Mursili II, who inherited a kingdom overwhelmed by grief and uncertainty. He pleaded with the gods to reveal why such suffering had fallen upon his family. His words are remarkably emotional, expressing confusion rather than certainty. To the Hittites, repeated deaths within the royal line were not viewed simply as unfortunate events. They were often interpreted as signs that divine favor had somehow been lost. The famous Edict of Telepinu offers another revealing glimpse into this troubled past. Unlike many royal inscriptions that celebrate only victories, this document openly recounts earlier assassinations, conspiracies, and struggles over succession. It acknowledges that violence within the royal household had become a recurring problem and attempts to establish clearer rules for inheritance in hopes of preventing further bloodshed. Even so, many individual deaths remain difficult to reconstruct. Some rulers disappear from the historical record with little explanation before another suddenly takes the throne. Official inscriptions rarely describe palace intrigue in detail, and later scribes may have had little interest in preserving accounts that undermined royal legitimacy. As a result, historians often work with fragments rather than complete narratives. Most scholars view these events as the product of political rivalry, uncertain succession, epidemic disease, and the immense pressures faced by one of the ancient world's leading empires. Others suggest that many crucial records have simply not survived. Countless clay tablets were destroyed when Hattusa eventually fell, while others may still lie buried beneath unexplored sections of the ancient capital. Every missing archive represents another missing chapter in the story. More speculative ideas occasionally emerge as well. Some researchers wonder whether powerful court officials quietly shaped royal succession from behind the scenes, leaving little direct evidence of their influence. Others ask whether later rulers deliberately removed embarrassing accounts of internal conspiracies from official archives. Although no convincing proof confirms these possibilities, the gaps within the surviving record continue to invite careful discussion. Today, the great stone gates of Hattusa stand in silence, overlooking a landscape that once echoed with royal processions and political ambition. The tablets recovered from its ruins have revealed extraordinary details about the Hittite world, yet they stop just short of answering its most personal mysteries. Somewhere beneath collapsed palaces or inside tablets still waiting to be translated, the final explanations may remain hidden, preserving secrets that the royal family carried with them into history's longest silence. The unanswered tragedies of the Hittite royal family remind us that history often preserves the aftermath of great events while concealing the moments that truly changed them. A similar silence lingers in the Nile Delta, where the capital of the Hyksos once stood at the height of its influence. When Egyptian armies finally reclaimed the region, they recovered more than a city. They inherited a mystery that has endured for nearly 4,000 years. The eastern Nile Delta is a world of quiet waterways, fertile fields, and shifting channels that have changed their course countless times since antiquity. Beneath layers of rich soil lie the remains of Avaris, a city that once served as the political and commercial heart of Hyksos rule in northern Egypt. Today, little hints at its former importance. Scattered foundations, fragments of painted walls, broken pottery, and the outlines of long-buried streets are all that remain of a settlement that once welcomed merchants, diplomats, soldiers, and craftsmen from across the eastern Mediterranean. Excavations have revealed a city unlike many others in ancient Egypt. Its architecture combines Egyptian traditions with influences from southern Canaan. Large residences stood beside workshops, warehouses, and temples where different religious customs appear to have coexisted. Imported ceramics, luxury goods, bronze weapons, and seals from distant regions suggest that Avaris was deeply connected to international trade. Rather than existing as an isolated foreign outpost, it functioned as a thriving crossroads where cultures blended and commerce flourished. For generations, the Hyksos governed much of northern Egypt from this strategic location. Their rulers maintained diplomatic ties with neighboring kingdoms, controlled important trade routes, and introduced military innovations, including the widespread use of horse-drawn chariots and advanced composite bows. Although later Egyptian records portrayed them as foreign occupiers, archaeology suggests a far more complex society that developed over decades through migration, cultural exchange, and political opportunity. Yet every powerful kingdom eventually faces a turning point. As rulers in Thebes strengthened their authority, they launched a determined effort to reunify Egypt. Kings such as Seqenenre-Tau, Kamose, and finally Ahmose I gradually pushed northward, reclaiming territory that had remained under Hyksos control for generations. Egyptian inscriptions celebrate these victories with language emphasizing liberation and military triumph, describing campaigns that ultimately reached the gates of Avaris itself. One might expect the archaeological evidence to reflect an overwhelming final battle. Surprisingly, the ruins tell a quieter story. Although signs of conflict exist within the wider region, many parts of Avaris do not display the extensive destruction usually associated with the violent capture of a major capital. Burned neighborhoods, collapsed defensive structures, and widespread evidence of prolonged urban warfare are far less prominent than many historians once expected. Some buildings remained structurally intact. Others appear to have been abandoned in an orderly fashion rather than destroyed during desperate fighting. This unexpected pattern raises an intriguing possibility. Did the Hyksos leave before the Egyptian army fully entered the city? Several excavated districts suggest that at least part of the population departed in a relatively organized manner. Valuable possessions are noticeably absent from certain homes, indicating that residents may have taken important belongings with them rather than abandoning everything in panic. Storage areas show signs of careful clearing, while some administrative buildings reveal no obvious evidence of hurried destruction. If Avaris had been evacuated gradually, what motivated such a decision? The most widely accepted explanation points toward military strategy. By the time Ahmose's forces reached the delta, the Hyksos leadership may have recognized that prolonged resistance inside the city would prove impossible. Rather than sacrificing their population in a final siege, they could have withdrawn toward southern Palestine, where Egyptian sources later describe a lengthy siege at the fortified city of Sharuhen. According to this interpretation, Avaris was not abandoned in confusion but deliberately surrendered as part of a broader retreat. Even so, important questions remain. If the withdrawal had been carefully planned, why were so many substantial buildings left standing? Why do certain areas show continued activity while others appear almost completely deserted? Archaeological evidence suggests that different parts of the city experienced different histories, making it difficult to reconstruct one simple sequence of events. Another possibility considers economics rather than warfare alone. Long before Egyptian armies arrived, shifting trade routes or political instability may already have weakened Avaris. A gradual decline in commercial importance could have encouraged merchants and skilled craftsmen to relocate elsewhere, leaving behind a city that was no longer as vibrant as it had once been. In this scenario, the Egyptian Reconquest completed a process already underway rather than causing it outright. The environment itself may also have played a role. The Nile Delta has never remained fixed. River branches naturally migrate over centuries, altering access to harbors, irrigation systems, and transportation routes. A settlement perfectly positioned for commerce during one generation can become increasingly isolated in another. Some researchers suggest that changing waterways slowly reduced Avaris's strategic value even before political events reshaped the region. Then there are the mysteries that archaeology has not yet resolved. Excavations have uncovered elaborate palaces, gardens, ceremonial buildings, and burials unlike those found elsewhere in Egypt. Some tombs contain individuals buried with horses, reflecting customs rarely seen along the Nile during earlier periods. Other discoveries hint at neighborhoods that remain only partially explored, extending beneath modern farmland where excavation remains difficult. It is entirely possible that significant portions of Avaris still lie untouched beneath the delta, preserving evidence capable of reshaping current interpretations. More speculative theories occasionally emerge from these gaps in the evidence. Some researchers wonder whether the Hyksos maintained secret agreements with certain Egyptian officials, allowing an orderly evacuation in exchange for avoiding unnecessary destruction. Others suggest that important royal archives may have been removed before the city's abandonment, explaining why relatively little direct Hyksos documentation has survived. A few even propose that undiscovered administrative quarters remain buried nearby, containing records that could clarify exactly how and why the capital was emptied. None of these ideas has been confirmed, yet each reflects the remarkable amount that remains unknown. After the Egyptian victory, the site did not disappear entirely. During the early New Kingdom, parts of Avaris continued to be occupied, and later nearby settlements developed into important royal centers. The landscape evolved, buildings were repurposed, and memories of the Hyksos gradually became intertwined with official Egyptian accounts that emphasized national reunification over the complexities of cultural exchange. Today, the fields covering ancient Avaris appear peaceful, interrupted only by archaeological trenches revealing fragments of streets that once bustled with life. Every foundation uncovered beneath the delta adds another piece to the puzzle, yet the city's final days remain elusive. Whether its people departed through careful planning, quiet necessity, or circumstances still hidden beneath the earth, Avaris continues to guard one of Egypt's most compelling unanswered stories. Somewhere beneath the fertile soil, another buried structure, forgotten inscription, or unopened chamber may still be waiting to reveal why an influential capital seemed to fade away before history recorded its final defeat. As the quiet streets of Avaris disappear beneath the fertile soil of the Nile Delta, another ancient silence waits across the Mediterranean. This time, the mystery is not centered on abandoned palaces or retreating rulers, but on something far less tangible. A belief system that once shaped an entire civilization gradually faded from view, leaving behind sacred spaces whose purpose can still be sensed, yet never fully understood. High above the coast of Crete, the wind moves gently through rugged mountains and hidden caves. In secluded sanctuaries, sunlight filters through narrow openings, illuminating stone altars that have remained undisturbed for thousands of years. Far below, the great palaces of Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia still reveal broad courtyards, ceremonial chambers, and carefully arranged rooms whose walls once displayed brilliant frescoes. Images of graceful figures, sacred horns, double axes, flowering landscapes, and ceremonial processions appear everywhere, suggesting that religion was woven into nearly every aspect of Minoan life. Yet for all its beauty, the spiritual world of the Minoans remains one of the least understood among the great civilizations of antiquity. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Minoans left no religious texts that modern scholars can confidently read. Their primary script, known as Linear A, has never been deciphered. Every inscription discovered on clay tablets, offering tables, or ceremonial vessels remains largely silent, preserving names, prayers, rituals, and beliefs that continue to resist translation. Archaeologists can examine temples, sacred objects, and artistic symbols, but the voices that once explained their meaning remain locked behind an undeciphered language. This silence has transformed every discovery into both an answer and another question. The Minoan religion appears to have emphasized nature, renewal, and sacred landscapes. Mountain peaks became places of worship, where shrines overlooked the surrounding countryside. Deep caves served as ceremonial sanctuaries, perhaps associated with fertility, seasonal cycles, or divine birth. Within palace complexes, carefully designed spaces seem to have hosted elaborate rituals involving music, offerings, feasting, and public ceremonies. Rather than separating religious life from daily existence, the Minoans appear to have integrated sacred traditions into the rhythm of their society. Many scholars believe that priestesses held especially prominent roles. Frescoes frequently depict women participating in rituals with an authority rarely matched elsewhere during the Bronze Age. Elegant robes, elaborate hairstyles, and symbolic gestures suggest carefully organized ceremonies led by individuals of considerable influence. Some researchers have proposed that female religious leaders occupied positions equal to, or perhaps even greater than, those of male officials within certain sacred traditions. For centuries, these practices endured. Then, during the late Bronze Age, they began to change. Around the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, many of Crete's major palaces experienced destruction or significant disruption. Some were rebuilt, while others never fully recovered. Administrative systems shifted, trade networks weakened, and eventually the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece established increasing influence over the island. Linear B, an early Greek writing system, gradually replaced the still undeciphered Linear A in administrative records. The political transformation is relatively well documented. The religious transformation is far less clear. Did the old priesthood disappear suddenly, or did it slowly adapt to a changing world? Archaeological evidence presents an intriguing mixture of continuity and change. Certain sacred symbols, including the famous double axe and the horns of consecration, continued to appear even after Mycenaean influence expanded. Some shrines remained active, while others were quietly abandoned. Religious objects once carefully arranged within temples were occasionally found broken, buried, or deliberately deposited in ways that suggest ritual closure rather than random destruction. Why were some sanctuaries preserved while others fell into silence? One widely accepted explanation points toward political change. As Mycenaean rulers assumed greater authority over Crete, they may have reorganized religious institutions to strengthen their own legitimacy. New elites often adopt existing sacred traditions while gradually reshaping them to support changing systems of government. Instead of eliminating Minoan religion entirely, they may have absorbed selected elements into their own cultural framework. Natural disasters may also have contributed. Earthquakes repeatedly affected Crete throughout its history, damaging temples and ceremonial centers. The enormous eruption of Thera during the 16th century BC likely disrupted trade, agriculture, and regional stability. Even if the eruption did not directly end Minoan civilization, it may have weakened the social foundations that supported its religious institutions. In times of prolonged crisis, belief systems sometimes evolve alongside the societies they serve. Yet several details remain difficult to explain. Peak sanctuaries that had attracted worshippers for generations appear to have declined without clear evidence of violent destruction. Certain sacred caves show signs of changing ritual practices before eventually falling out of regular use. Some ceremonial spaces inside the palaces were never fully restored, even when surrounding buildings continued to function. The pattern suggests something more gradual than sudden collapse, but also more significant than ordinary cultural change. The undeciphered Linear A script deepens the mystery further. Every untranslated inscription may contain hymns, temple inventories, priestly records, or accounts describing the final years of Minoan worship. Without understanding the language, historians cannot know whether the religion faced internal reform, political conflict, or entirely different challenges that archaeology alone cannot reveal. It is possible that the most important explanations have survived all this time, hidden in plain sight upon tablets that no one can yet read. Some researchers have explored more speculative possibilities. A few have suggested that religious authority gradually shifted away from the great palaces toward smaller local communities, leaving fewer monumental traces behind. Others wonder whether important ceremonial centers remain undiscovered beneath later settlements, preserving evidence of rituals unlike anything currently known. There are even proposals that parts of Minoan spiritual tradition survived indirectly within later Greek religious practices, transformed over generations until their original meaning became impossible to recognize. While these ideas remain unproven, they reflect the extraordinary complexity of a civilization whose spiritual life is known almost entirely through material remains. Standing today within the quiet courtyards of Hyksos, or inside the cool darkness of a mountain sanctuary, it is easy to sense that these places once carried profound meaning for those who gathered there. The stones remain carefully arranged. The sacred caves still echo with silence. The symbols carved into seals and painted across ancient walls continue to repeat their mysterious patterns without offering clear explanations. Somewhere beneath Crete's hillsides, inside an unopened shrine, or within a future decipherment of Linear A, the missing chapter of Minoan religion may still survive, waiting to reveal why one of the ancient world's most distinctive spiritual traditions slowly disappeared, while leaving behind so many enduring questions. The fading echoes of Minoan sanctuaries remind us that a civilization can lose more than its monuments. Sometimes its language, beliefs, and identity gradually dissolve until only scattered traces remain. Thousands of kilometers to the east, another civilization experienced a transformation just as profound. Its cities did not simply disappear overnight. Instead, one of the ancient world's greatest urban societies slowly unraveled, leaving behind an enduring mystery that continues to challenge archaeologists today. As dawn breaks over the plains of the Indus River, rows of weathered bricks emerge from the earth in remarkable silence. Broad streets stretch across carefully planned neighborhoods, intersecting at precise angles as they did more than 4,000 years ago. Deep wells still descend into the ground, while sophisticated drainage channels run beneath houses that once sheltered thousands of people. At Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, and dozens of other ancient settlements, the remains reveal extraordinary organization, engineering, and civic planning. Yet despite their impressive design, these cities eventually fell quiet, their bustling streets abandoned without leaving a clear explanation. The Indus Valley civilization flourished between roughly 2600 and 1900 BC, extending across a vast region that today includes parts of Pakistan and northwestern India. At its height, it covered an area larger than many contemporary civilizations, supporting millions of people through agriculture, trade, craftsmanship, and carefully managed urban development. Standardized weights, precisely fired bricks, and widespread commercial networks demonstrate an impressive level of coordination across enormous distances. What makes this civilization especially remarkable is not only its sophistication, but also its unusual character. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, there is little evidence of massive royal palaces, monumental statues celebrating powerful kings, or enormous temples dominating the skyline. Archaeologists have found no definitive royal tombs filled with extravagant treasures. Instead, the cities appear to have emphasized orderly planning, public infrastructure, and practical engineering. Whether this reflects a different form of government or simply an archaeological gap remains uncertain. The civilization also left behind thousands of carved seals bearing short inscriptions written in the still undeciphered Indus script. Animals such as bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, and mythical creatures appear alongside symbols whose meanings remain unknown. Every seal hints at names, beliefs, commercial records, or administrative systems that modern scholars have yet to understand. Then, after centuries of stability, subtle changes began to appear. Around 1900 BC, many major cities experienced gradual decline. Construction slowed. Standardized manufacturing became less consistent. Long-distance trade with Mesopotamia diminished, and some urban neighborhoods were abandoned. Rather than one dramatic catastrophe, archaeology reveals a prolonged transformation unfolding over generations. What caused such a widespread change? One of the strongest explanations focuses on climate. Geological evidence suggests that changing monsoon patterns gradually reduced the amount of rainfall across parts of the region. Rivers that had sustained agriculture for centuries became less reliable, while prolonged drought placed increasing pressure on farming communities. Among the most significant changes may have involved the Ghaggar-Hakra river system, which many researchers believe experienced substantial shifts in its flow over time. For cities dependent upon predictable water supplies, even gradual environmental changes could have profound consequences. Another possibility involves the rivers themselves. The Indus and its tributaries have always been dynamic, frequently changing course over long periods. Flooding, erosion, and shifting channels may have disrupted transportation networks and damaged agricultural land. Entire settlements could find themselves cut off from trade routes or reliable water sources without any single catastrophic event occurring. Economic pressures likely added to these environmental challenges. Trade between the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia declined during the later stages of the civilization. Imported materials became less common, while specialized craft production appears to have decreased in several urban centers. As commercial connections weakened, the economic systems supporting large cities may have become increasingly difficult to maintain. Yet these explanations still leave important questions unanswered. If environmental stress was the primary cause, why did some settlements survive while others were abandoned? Why did populations appear to shift toward smaller rural communities instead of disappearing altogether? Archaeological evidence suggests that many people continued living throughout the region, adapting to changing conditions rather than simply vanishing. This observation has reshaped modern understanding. Instead of describing a sudden collapse, many historians now speak of a gradual decentralization. Large urban centers slowly gave way to smaller villages better suited to evolving environmental and economic conditions. The civilization may not have ended as dramatically as once believed. Instead, it may have transformed into something less centralized and therefore less visible within the archaeological record. The undeciphered script continues to deepen the mystery. Without the ability to read administrative records, religious texts, or historical accounts, historians remain unable to hear the civilization explain its own experience. Did its people record years of drought, political disagreements, changing trade partnerships, or social reforms? Did they anticipate the decline unfolding around them, or did each generation simply adapt without recognizing the larger transformation taking place? Every unread inscription represents a missing voice. Some more speculative theories have emerged over the years. Earlier suggestions proposed large-scale invasions that overwhelmed the cities, but archaeological evidence has provided little support for widespread violent conquest as the primary cause. Other researchers have wondered whether epidemic disease contributed to urban decline, although direct evidence remains limited. Still others suggest that important settlements remain buried beneath modern towns or deep layers of river sediment, preserving archives capable of answering many unresolved questions. While these possibilities remain uncertain, they demonstrate how much of the civilization's final chapter is still hidden. One of the greatest puzzles involves continuity. Cultural traditions associated with the Indus Valley did not disappear completely. Certain styles of pottery, agricultural practices, technologies, and settlement patterns continued long after the great cities declined. This suggests that the civilization's people endured, even as their urban world changed beyond recognition. The disappearance, then, may belong less to the population itself than to a particular way of organizing society. Today, visitors walking through the silent streets of Mohenjo-Daro encounter a city that still feels remarkably modern. Straight roads, carefully engineered drainage systems, public wells, and brick houses create the impression of a community designed with extraordinary foresight. Yet its final days remain largely unwritten. Somewhere beneath unexplored ruins, hidden beneath layers of alluvial soil, or preserved within inscriptions that have yet to be deciphered, the missing pages of the Indus Valley civilization may still exist. Until those silent symbols finally reveal their meaning, one of humanity's most sophisticated urban societies will continue to stand as one of history's most compelling and enduring mysteries. As the silent streets of the Indus Valley leave behind questions that no surviving inscription can answer, another ancient world invites us into a different kind of mystery. Here, the cities are known, the temples have been uncovered, and thousands of artifacts have emerged from the earth. Yet the ceremonies once performed within these sacred places remain only partially understood, their meanings concealed behind symbols, broken inscriptions, and traditions that faded long before history could record them in full. Along the Mediterranean coast of the ancient Levant, waves roll gently against weathered cliffs, while the evening sun casts long shadows across the ruins of forgotten sanctuaries. Stone altars stand exposed beneath open skies, surrounded by fragments of carved pillars, offering tables and ceremonial vessels blackened by centuries of age. Incense burners, bronze figurines, decorated chalices, and carefully shaped standing stones remain scattered across archaeological sites in what is now Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and neighboring regions. Together, they form the surviving traces of the Canaanite world, a civilization whose spiritual traditions once shaped much of the eastern Mediterranean. Unlike many neighboring civilizations, the Canaanites were not governed by a single unified kingdom. Instead, they lived within a network of prosperous city-states connected through trade, diplomacy, language, and shared religious customs. Cities such as Ugarit, Megiddo, Hazor, Byblos, and Tyre each maintained their own rulers while participating in a broader cultural landscape that stretched across the region during the second millennium BC. Religion occupied the center of daily life. The Canaanite pantheon included numerous deities associated with storms, fertility, agriculture, craftsmanship, the sea, and the changing seasons. Among the best known were El, often portrayed as an aged father figure; Baal, connected with storms and rainfall; Asherah, frequently associated with motherhood and fertility; and Anat, remembered in surviving texts as a fierce and powerful goddess. Together, these figures formed a complex spiritual system reflecting both the natural world and the uncertainties of human existence. Much of what scholars know about these beliefs comes from the remarkable discovery of clay tablets at the ancient city of Ugarit. Written in a previously unknown alphabetic cuneiform script, these texts preserve myths, hymns, and ritual instructions that transformed modern understanding of Canaanite religion. For the first time, Archaeologists could hear echoes of ceremonies that had remained silent for thousands of years. Even so, enormous gaps remain. The surviving texts represent only a fraction of what once existed. Countless temples have yielded ritual objects without accompanying explanations. Sacred spaces survive, but the voices that gave them meaning are often absent. Every altar raises questions that no inscription fully answers. Archaeological excavations have uncovered temples with carefully designed entrances, elevated platforms, and stone basins that may have been used for purification rituals. Animal bones discovered within ceremonial areas indicate that offerings formed an important part of religious practice. Burned incense, wine, oil, grain, and livestock were likely presented during festivals tied to seasonal cycles, agricultural harvests, and royal ceremonies. Yet some discoveries appear more enigmatic. Across several sites, archaeologists have found standing stones known as massboth. These upright monuments vary greatly in size and arrangement. Some appear individually, while others stand together within enclosed sacred courtyards. Were they symbolic representations of particular deities? Did they commemorate ancestors, treaties, or important religious events? Or did they serve purposes that have been entirely forgotten? Without explanatory texts, their precise role remains uncertain. Another mystery surrounds the high places mentioned in both archaeological and historical sources. These elevated sanctuaries often occupied hills overlooking surrounding valleys. Stone platforms, altars, and offering areas suggest that they hosted important public ceremonies. Their locations may have strengthened connections between worship, landscape, and the changing rhythms of nature. Yet relatively little survives to explain what participants experienced during these gatherings or how individual rituals unfolded. Some of the greatest debate concerns evidence interpreted by certain scholars as relating to child sacrifice. Ancient writers from neighboring civilizations later accused some Canaanite communities of practicing such rituals under exceptional circumstances. Archaeological evidence, however, remains the subject of continuing discussion. At several sites, including Carthage, a civilization culturally linked to earlier Canaanite traditions, burial areas containing the remains of infants have generated decades of scholarly debate. Some researchers interpret these discoveries as evidence supporting ritual sacrifice. Others argue that the burials instead reflect cemeteries for children who died naturally, with no conclusive proof of sacrificial practices. Because the evidence remains incomplete, historians continue to approach this subject with caution. No single explanation has achieved universal acceptance, reminding us how easily later interpretations can influence our understanding of ancient cultures. The mysteries extend beyond individual ceremonies. Religious authority itself remains difficult to reconstruct. Did powerful priesthoods control the temples, or did civic leaders oversee ritual life alongside political responsibilities? Were certain ceremonies open to entire communities, while others remained restricted to carefully selected participants? The archaeological record offers clues but few definitive answers. Many temples contain rooms that appear separated from public spaces by narrow corridors or enclosed chambers. These secluded areas have prompted speculation that certain rites were reserved for priests, rulers, or initiates. Ritual vessels discovered within these rooms often differ from those used elsewhere, suggesting specialized functions. Yet their exact purpose remains unknown. The symbols decorating Canaanite artifacts deepen the mystery further. Serpents, winged creatures, sacred trees, lions, bulls, stars, and stylized floral designs appear repeatedly across seals, jewelry, pottery, and temple carvings. Some motifs clearly represented divine protection or fertility, while others may have carried meanings now permanently lost. A single carved seal may have communicated complex religious ideas that modern observers can only partially recognize. More speculative theories occasionally emerge from these unanswered questions. Some researchers have proposed that the Canaanites preserved esoteric traditions transmitted orally from one generation of priests to the next, explaining why so few written ritual manuals have survived. Others suggest that ceremonies varied considerably between city-states, making it impossible to describe one unified Canaanite religion. A few even wonder whether important temple archives remain buried beneath later settlements, waiting to reveal liturgies, hymns, and ceremonial instructions capable of transforming current scholarship. While such possibilities remain unverified, they illustrate how much remains hidden beneath the region's long and complex history. One remarkable aspect of Canaanite religion is its lasting influence. Elements of its language, symbolism, mythology, and ritual vocabulary appear to have interacted with neighboring cultures throughout the ancient Near East. Religious ideas rarely remain confined within political borders. They evolve, merge, and adapt as merchants, travelers, and diplomats carry traditions across generations. Distinguishing original beliefs from later developments therefore becomes increasingly difficult as centuries pass. Today, the ruins of ancient temples stand beneath open skies, their stone altars exposed to wind, rain, and sunlight, just as they have been for millennia. Broken figurines rest where worshippers once placed offerings with quiet reverence. Empty courtyards that once echoed with chants and ceremonial music now preserve only silence. Yet every excavation uncovers another fragment, a carved inscription, an incense burner, a sacred vessel, or a forgotten sanctuary, that hints at a spiritual world far richer than the surviving evidence alone can reveal. Somewhere beneath the soil of the ancient Levant, within an unopened temple archive or an undiscovered sacred chamber, the missing pieces of the Canaanite ritual tradition may still endure, waiting to illuminate ceremonies whose deepest meanings have remained hidden since the Bronze Age. The silent temples of the Canaanites remind us that sacred traditions often outlive the people who created them. Long after prayers have faded and ceremonies have ended, altars, symbols, and sanctuaries remain behind, inviting new generations to wonder who once stood within them. Across the Mediterranean, on the island of Crete, another spiritual mystery lingers among the ruins of an even older civilization. This time, the question is not only how a religion changed, but what became of the people who guided it. Morning sunlight spills across the broad central court of the Palace of Knossos, illuminating weathered columns, worn staircases, and faded frescoes that still retain traces of brilliant color. Beyond the palace walls, mountain peaks rise above the island, where isolated shrines overlook fertile valleys and the distant sea. Hidden inside caves carved by nature, stone altars and offering tables remain untouched, their surfaces smoothed by centuries of quiet devotion. These were not isolated places of worship. Together, they formed a sacred landscape that shaped Minoan life for generations. Yet one remarkable absence continues to puzzle historians. The priesthood that once maintained these sanctuaries seems to vanish from history with almost no direct explanation. Unlike Egypt, where inscriptions proudly identify priests and temple officials, the Minoans left no readable records describing their religious hierarchy. Their principal writing system, Linear A, remains undeciphered, preventing scholars from understanding titles, rituals, prayers, or administrative responsibilities preserved on surviving tablets. Every inscription may contain references to ceremonies or sacred offices, but until the script can be read with confidence, those voices remain silent. Archaeology, therefore, becomes the primary guide. Throughout Crete, excavations have uncovered ceremonial objects unlike ordinary household possessions. Stone libation tables, rita shaped like animal heads, carefully carved offering vessels, bronze double axes, and finely crafted figurines appear within temples, caves, and palace sanctuaries. Frescoes portray elegant processions, ritual gatherings, and individuals dressed in elaborate garments whose appearance differs noticeably from that of ordinary citizens. Many researchers believe these figures represent members of the Minoan priesthood. Women appear especially prominent within this artistic tradition. Frescoes frequently depict richly dressed female figures participating in ceremonies with striking confidence and authority. Their raised hands, symbolic objects, and distinctive clothing suggest carefully defined ritual roles. Some archaeologists have proposed that priestesses occupied the highest positions within Minoan religious life, overseeing festivals, seasonal ceremonies, and sacred rites connected to fertility, agriculture, and renewal. Others urge caution. Art alone cannot always distinguish priests from nobles, royal family members, or symbolic representations of divine beings. Without written explanations, every interpretation remains provisional. What seems obvious in one generation of scholarship may be reconsidered as new discoveries emerge. Still, the consistency of these images raises an important question. If an organized priesthood existed for centuries, what happened to it? During the Late Bronze Age, Crete experienced profound change. Several major palaces suffered destruction, trade networks shifted, and Mycenaean influence gradually expanded across the island. Administrative documents written in Linear B, an early form of Greek, eventually replaced the undeciphered Linear A used by the Minoans. Political authority changed hands, and new cultural traditions became increasingly visible. The religious evidence, however, is more complicated. Certain sanctuaries continued operating after the political transition. Sacred symbols such as the double axe and the horns of consecration remained in use for some time, while other ceremonial traditions appear to have evolved rather than disappeared. Yet many peak sanctuaries and cave shrines gradually fell silent. Offerings became less frequent. Ritual spaces were abandoned or repurposed. Some sacred objects were carefully buried, while others remained exactly where they had last been used. Was this the end of the Minoan priesthood, or simply the beginning of its transformation? One widely accepted explanation suggests that the Mycenaean rulers gradually absorbed existing religious institutions into their own political system. Rather than removing local priests entirely, they may have incorporated familiar ceremonies into a new administrative structure. Throughout history, conquering powers have often preserved respected religious traditions to strengthen their own legitimacy. If this occurred on Crete, the priesthood may never have truly disappeared. It may simply have changed its identity. Another possibility emphasizes gradual social change instead of political intervention. Religious institutions often depend upon economic stability. As trade declined and palace economies weakened, maintaining large ceremonial centers may have become increasingly difficult. Priests and priestesses could have dispersed into smaller local communities, where their activities left fewer monumental traces for archaeologists to uncover. Natural disasters may also have contributed. Crete lies within a seismically active region where earthquakes have repeatedly reshaped both the landscape and its settlements. The massive eruption of Thera during the 16th century BC affected the wider Aegean world, disrupting trade, agriculture, and communication. Although most researchers no longer believe the eruption alone destroyed Minoan civilization, it may have initiated a prolonged period of instability. Religious leaders who once interpreted the rhythms of nature may have found themselves confronting disasters unlike anything their traditions had anticipated. The silence of Linear A deepens every uncertainty. Hundreds of tablets survive, preserving lists, inventories, and administrative records that undoubtedly belonged to the functioning society of Minoan Crete. Yet, because the script remains unreadable, historians cannot determine whether these texts mention temples, priestly offices, sacred festivals, or theological ideas. It is entirely possible that the missing story of the Minoan priesthood has survived all along, waiting only for the language itself to surrender its meaning. Several discoveries have encouraged even deeper reflection. At sites such as Knossos, Hyksos, Zakros, and various mountain sanctuaries, archaeologists have uncovered ceremonial spaces that appear to have been intentionally closed rather than violently destroyed. Sacred vessels were carefully placed. Entrances were sealed. Objects remained arranged in deliberate patterns, suggesting final rituals performed before abandonment. Were these acts of reverence marking the conclusion of centuries-old traditions? Or were they temporary measures carried out by priests expecting to return one day? No surviving text provides the answer. More speculative interpretations occasionally arise from these mysteries. Some researchers have proposed that the highest-ranking members of the priesthood relocated to isolated sanctuaries beyond the major palaces, preserving fragments of their traditions in remote communities now lost to history. Others wonder whether aspects of Minoan religious practice quietly influenced later Greek spiritual traditions, surviving not through institutions but through symbols, myths, and ceremonial customs that evolved over many generations. A few even suggest that undiscovered temple archives remain buried beneath later construction, preserving records capable of identifying the names and responsibilities of the very individuals whose existence can presently only be inferred. None of these ideas has been confirmed, but each reflects the remarkable gaps that still exist within the archaeological record. Standing today in the cool silence of a Cretan cave sanctuary, or beneath the towering columns of Knossos, it is easy to imagine the distant echoes of ritual music, the fragrance of burning incense, and the measured footsteps of those entrusted with guiding one of Europe's earliest spiritual traditions. The temples remain. The sacred symbols endure. The mountain shrines continue to overlook the island, as they have for thousands of years. Yet the people who once gave these places meaning have almost completely vanished from history. Somewhere beneath untouched ruins, inside an unopened chamber, or hidden within the undeciphered signs of Linear A, the final chapter of the Minoan priesthood may still survive, waiting quietly for the moment when its long-held secrets can finally be understood. If the disappearance of the Minoan priesthood left behind unanswered questions about those who guided the island's sacred traditions, another mystery reaches even deeper into its spiritual world. Hidden within palace storerooms and forgotten shrines are small ceramic figures whose calm expressions have endured for nearly 4,000 years. Though they fit comfortably in the palm of a hand, they have inspired more debate than monuments many times their size. They are known today as the snake goddess figurines, yet even that familiar name conceals more uncertainty than certainty. Inside the restored chambers of the Palace of Knossos, sunlight filters through narrow windows and falls upon walls once covered with brilliant frescoes. Beyond the grand courtyards lie small rooms that archaeologists believe served ceremonial purposes. It was within one of these sacred repositories that several remarkable figurines were discovered in the early 20th century. Fashioned from glazed faience with extraordinary craftsmanship, they portray elegantly dressed women standing upright with uncovered arms extended outward. Coiled snakes wind around their bodies and hands, while elaborate crowns rise above carefully styled hair. Even after thousands of years, the figures project an unmistakable sense of confidence and quiet authority. From the moment they were uncovered, they captured the imagination of scholars. At first glance, the symbolism appears straightforward. Throughout many ancient cultures, snakes represented renewal because they shed their skin, emerging seemingly transformed. They were also associated with protection, fertility, healing, and the hidden forces of the natural world. It seemed reasonable to suggest that these remarkable figures represented an important goddess whose worship occupied a central place within Minoan religion. Yet, archaeology rarely rewards simple conclusions. The title, Snake Goddess, is itself a modern invention. No surviving Minoan inscription identifies these figures, and because Linear A remains undeciphered, no ancient text confirms their identity. The people who created them left no readable explanation describing who they represented, how they were used, or whether they depicted a deity, a priestess, or something entirely different. The figurines therefore stand at the intersection of evidence and interpretation. Some researchers believe they portray a major female deity connected with fertility, household protection, agricultural renewal, or the cycles of nature. Their confident posture and carefully crafted clothing suggest figures of exceptional importance. Snakes appear repeatedly within Minoan art, reinforcing the possibility that these animals held profound symbolic meaning, extending far beyond simple decoration. Others argue that the figures may instead represent high-ranking priestesses participating in sacred ceremonies. Their elaborate garments closely resemble clothing seen in Minoan frescoes, where richly dressed women appear leading processions and ritual gatherings. If this interpretation is correct, the figurines may preserve images of living religious officials rather than supernatural beings. A third possibility is even more intriguing. Rather than depicting one specific individual, the figures may symbolize an idealized relationship between humanity and the sacred world. In many ancient societies, religious art emphasized concepts rather than portraits. The combination of human form and symbolic animals could have expressed spiritual authority itself, reminding worshippers of invisible forces believed to govern the balance between nature and civilization. Without written explanations, certainty remains impossible. The circumstances surrounding their discovery deepen the mystery. The figurines were found inside carefully sealed repositories within the palace at Hyksos. Alongside them rested ritual vessels, offering tables, and other ceremonial objects that appear to have been deliberately stored rather than casually discarded. Archaeologists generally believe these collections were intentionally deposited following damage caused by earthquakes or other disruptions. Sacred objects may have been respectfully retired instead of destroyed. Why were these particular figures placed there? Had they completed their ceremonial purpose? Were they being protected during a period of instability? Or were they part of a final ritual marking the end of an older religious tradition? The answers remain hidden. Beyond Knossos, snake imagery appears at several Minoan sites across Crete. Seals, rings, pottery, and frescoes frequently include serpentine forms intertwined with plants, animals, or human figures. Yet, surprisingly few objects closely resemble the famous faience figurines themselves. If a widespread cult centered upon a snake goddess truly existed, why are comparable statues so rare? Some historians suggest that only the most important temples possessed such sacred images, making them exceptional rather than commonplace. Others propose that many were fashioned from perishable materials that have long since disappeared. Wood, textiles, painted plaster, and organic substances rarely survive thousands of years, leaving archaeologists with only a fraction of the original ceremonial landscape. The broader religious setting adds further complexity. Unlike many neighboring civilizations, the Minoans built relatively few monumental temples separated from everyday life. Instead, sacred spaces appear throughout palaces, caves, mountain sanctuaries, and domestic settings. Religion was woven into ordinary existence rather than confined to isolated structures. Within such a system, the snake goddess, if she truly was a goddess, may have represented only one element of a much larger spiritual tradition that modern archaeology can perceive only in fragments. As Mycenaean influence expanded across Crete during the Late Bronze Age, many aspects of Minoan religious life gradually changed. Some sacred symbols survived, while others disappeared from the archaeological record. The distinctive snake goddess figurines themselves were no longer produced in the same recognizable form. Whether this reflected changing beliefs, political transformation, or shifting artistic traditions remains uncertain. The undeciphered Linear A script continues to stand between historians and the answers they seek. Among the hundreds of surviving inscriptions may be temple inventories listing sacred images, records describing festivals, or offerings dedicated to deities whose names have been forgotten. A single, successful decipherment could dramatically alter current understanding, revealing whether the famous figurines represented one goddess, several divine figures, important priestesses, or concepts entirely unlike those imagined today. More speculative ideas occasionally emerge from this uncertainty. Some researchers have wondered whether the snake goddess represented only one aspect of a larger and more complex religious system, in which different manifestations of the divine appeared through animals, natural forces, and seasonal cycles. Others suggest that later Greek myths preserving powerful female figures associated with wisdom, nature, or sacred animals may contain distant echoes of far older Minoan traditions, transformed across centuries until their original meaning became almost impossible to recognize. A few even propose that undiscovered sanctuaries beneath unexplored areas of Crete still contain ceremonial objects capable of placing the famous figurines within their proper context. While none of these possibilities can yet be confirmed, they continue to inspire careful investigation. Today, the small faience figures stand quietly behind museum glass, admired by countless visitors who pause before them in silent curiosity. Their raised hands still hold serpents whose meaning has outlived the civilization that shaped them. Their calm expressions reveal neither fear nor certainty, only an enduring sense of mystery. Somewhere beneath the palaces of Crete, inside an unopened shrine, or hidden within inscriptions that no one has yet learned to read, the forgotten story of the snake goddess, or whoever these remarkable figures truly represent, may still be waiting, preserving a chapter of Minoan belief that has remained just beyond human understanding for nearly 4,000 years. The silent gaze of the so-called snake goddess reminds us that ancient civilizations often leave behind objects, but rarely the voices needed to explain them. Just as those figurines preserve a mystery without a clear answer, another Aegean site tells a story through what is missing rather than what remains. It is a place where an entire community appears to have escaped disaster, only to vanish from history without leaving a trace of where its people ultimately went. On the volcanic island of Thera, known today as Santorini, layers of hardened ash conceal one of the best-preserved settlements of the Bronze Age. Beneath protective shelters, the streets of Akrotiri remain astonishingly intact. Multi-story buildings still stand several meters high. Staircases climb toward upper floors that no longer exist, while colorful frescoes continue to depict ships sailing across calm seas, blooming lilies, playful monkeys, and people engaged in daily life. Storage jars remain lined against walls. Workshops preserve the tools of long-forgotten craftsmen, and carefully paved streets wind between homes that once echoed with ordinary conversation. At first glance, Akrotiri resembles a city frozen in time. Yet one remarkable detail separates it from many other ancient disaster sites. The people are gone. When archaeologists began uncovering Akrotiri during the 20th century, they expected to find victims preserved beneath volcanic deposits, much as later excavations revealed at Pompeii. Instead, they encountered something very different. Human remains are exceptionally rare, and no large groups of victims have been discovered within homes, streets, or public buildings. This absence immediately raised one of the site's greatest mysteries. How did an entire population disappear before one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded history? Scientific evidence suggests that the eruption of Thera during the 16th century BC unfolded through several stages rather than occurring without warning. Powerful earthquakes likely shook the island beforehand, damaging buildings and alerting residents that something unusual was happening. Initial volcanic activity may have produced ash clouds and smaller explosions before the catastrophic eruption reached its full intensity. These warning signs could have provided valuable time. Archaeologists have identified evidence supporting this idea. Many buildings show signs of earthquake damage that appears to have been partially cleared before thick volcanic deposits buried the settlement. Rubble had been moved from certain streets. Some doorways were reopened. It seems that residents briefly returned after the first earthquakes, perhaps attempting repairs or gathering essential possessions. Then they left. Large storage vessels remain inside many buildings, but smaller valuables are noticeably absent. Jewelry, precious metals, and portable objects appear surprisingly scarce. The pattern suggests deliberate evacuation rather than sudden panic. Families may have carried with them whatever they considered most important, expecting eventually to return. But they never did. Where did they go? The most widely accepted explanation proposes that Akrotiri's inhabitants escaped by sea. Thera occupied an important position within Aegean trade networks, and its people possessed considerable maritime experience. Ships illustrated in the famous flotilla fresco reveal sophisticated vessels capable of transporting both people and cargo. If the harbor remained accessible during the early stages of volcanic unrest, evacuation by boat would have been entirely possible. Yet survival raises another question. Why does the archaeological record preserve so little evidence of what became of these refugees? Some historians believe many reached Crete, whose thriving Minoan civilization maintained close commercial ties with Thera. Shared artistic styles, architecture, and material culture suggest strong connections between the two islands. Refugees may have settled among existing Minoan communities, gradually blending into local populations without leaving clearly identifiable traces. Others suggest that survivors dispersed across several islands throughout the Aegean, joining relatives, trading partners, or established colonies. If families divided among numerous destinations, their identity as former residents of Akrotiri may have disappeared within only a generation or two. The timing of the eruption complicates matters further. The disaster appears to have occurred during a period when the Minoan world itself was entering an era of increasing instability. Trade networks shifted, political authority evolved, and several important centers eventually experienced disruption. If refugees arrived amid broader regional changes, later upheavals may have obscured whatever evidence they left behind. The volcanic eruption itself had consequences extending far beyond Thera. Geological studies indicate that enormous quantities of ash entered the atmosphere, while tsunamis generated by the eruption likely struck nearby coastlines. Coastal settlements throughout the Aegean may have suffered severe damage. Maritime commerce, the foundation of regional prosperity, would almost certainly have been disrupted for years. Even communities untouched by ash may have struggled to recover from the economic consequences. Could the survivors of Akrotiri have escaped the eruption only to encounter entirely different hardships elsewhere? The archaeological evidence cannot yet answer. One particularly intriguing feature of Akrotiri is the remarkable level of organization visible during its final days. Streets appear relatively orderly. Few signs suggest widespread looting or violent disorder. The settlement seems to have been abandoned with surprising discipline. Such coordination implies that community leaders retained authority during the evacuation, organizing departures rather than allowing chaos to unfold. Who directed such an operation? Did priests interpret the volcanic activity as a warning from the gods? Did experienced sailors recognize the danger before others understood its scale? Or did ordinary families simply respond to unmistakable signs that remaining on the island was no longer possible? No surviving text records those final decisions. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Aegean civilizations of this period left very few readable historical narratives. Linear A, used by the Minoans and likely familiar within Akrotiri, remains undeciphered. If official records describing the evacuation were ever written, they cannot yet be understood. It is entirely possible that eyewitness accounts still exist upon clay tablets whose language continues to resist interpretation. More speculative ideas occasionally emerge from these enduring uncertainties. Some researchers wonder whether the refugees established temporary settlements that remain undiscovered beneath later towns or coastal sediments. Others suggest that memories of the catastrophe survived for centuries through oral traditions before evolving into later legends describing prosperous islands destroyed by overwhelming natural forces. While such connections cannot be demonstrated with certainty, they reflect humanity's enduring attempt to understand extraordinary events through storytelling. There is also the possibility that Akrotiri's survivors never remained together as a distinct community. Instead, they may have been absorbed so completely into neighboring societies that their descendants no longer remembered the island their ancestors had fled. In this view, the disappearance was not one of lives, but of identity. Today, visitors walking through the preserved streets of Akrotiri encounter an ancient city that feels strangely expectant, as though its residents have stepped away only briefly. Empty rooms still contain cooking vessels. Painted walls continue to brighten dark interiors. Staircases lead toward vanished upper floors where families once watched the sea stretching beyond the harbor. Everything suggests departure rather than destruction. Yet the people themselves remain absent, their final destination hidden beyond the reach of archaeology. Somewhere along an overlooked shoreline, beneath forgotten settlements, or within inscriptions that have yet to reveal their meaning, the story of Akrotiri's survivors may still endure, quietly waiting to explain what became of an entire community that escaped one of history's greatest natural disasters, only to disappear into the silence that followed. The empty streets of Akrotiri remind us that people can disappear while their homes remain behind. Yet beyond those silent buildings stretched the sea itself, an ancient highway connecting kingdoms, cultures, and distant ports. Countless ships crossed its waters every year, carrying copper, tin, ivory, spices, timber, precious stones, and messages between some of the world's earliest civilizations. Most reached their destinations. Others sailed into history and were never seen again. At sunrise, the waters of the eastern Mediterranean appear calm and almost endless. Gentle waves reflect the light as rocky coastlines emerge from the morning haze. Hidden beneath this tranquil surface lies another landscape entirely. Ancient anchors rest among coral-covered reefs. Amphorae lie scattered across the seabed, their contents long vanished. Bronze tools, shattered timbers, stone ballast, and forgotten cargoes remain undisturbed in deep water, preserved by the sea long after cities on land have crumbled into dust. For thousands of years, this sea served as the commercial heart of the Bronze Age world. Merchant vessels sailed between Egypt, Crete, Cyprus, Anatolia, the Levant, and islands scattered across the Aegean. They transported raw materials that allowed civilizations to flourish. Copper from Cyprus combined with tin from distant regions to produce bronze, the metal that transformed warfare, agriculture, architecture, and craftsmanship. Without reliable maritime trade, many of these societies could not have maintained their economies or political influence. The archaeological record confirms the remarkable scale of this network. One of the most famous discoveries, the Uluburun shipwreck off the southern coast of Anatolia, revealed an extraordinary cargo dating to the 14th century BC. Copper ingots, tin, glass, ivory, ebony, precious jewelry, ceramics, and luxury goods from multiple civilizations were all loaded aboard a single vessel. The wreck demonstrated that international trade during the Bronze Age was far more sophisticated than once imagined. If one ship could carry such wealth, how many others crossed these waters unnoticed? The answer remains unknown. Ancient texts frequently describe fleets arriving at busy ports, royal gifts exchanged between distant kingdoms, and commercial expeditions lasting many months. Egyptian inscriptions celebrate successful maritime journeys. Hittite treaties refer to overseas trade. Archives from Ugarit record merchants, cargoes, and diplomatic correspondence moving across the sea. Together, these documents suggest that hundreds, perhaps thousands, of merchant voyages took place over successive generations. Yet only a tiny fraction has ever been found. Most ancient ships were constructed primarily from wood, held together with carefully fitted joints, ropes, and wooden pegs. Unless rapidly buried beneath sediment or resting in oxygen-poor environments, these vessels gradually disappeared beneath centuries of biological decay. Their cargoes scattered across the seabed, while currents carried lighter materials far from the original wreck site. Even so, certain discoveries hint at losses far greater than historians once suspected. Storms represented a constant danger. Seasonal winds could change without warning, driving heavily loaded vessels toward rocky coastlines. Narrow passages between islands created powerful currents capable of overwhelming even experienced sailors. Navigation depended upon stars, coastal landmarks, and accumulated knowledge passed from one generation to the next. A single miscalculation during darkness or poor weather could prove fatal. Piracy added another layer of uncertainty. Although dramatic accounts of pirates often belong to later periods, evidence suggests that maritime raiding existed throughout the Bronze Age. Merchant ships carrying valuable metals, luxury goods, and food supplies would have presented tempting targets for organized attackers. Some vessels may have vanished not because of storms, but because their cargo attracted unwanted attention far from the safety of any harbor. Political instability also threatened maritime commerce. The Eastern Mediterranean depended upon cooperation between kingdoms separated by great distances. Diplomatic agreements protected trade routes, while established ports provided shelter and supplies. During periods of war or political collapse, these carefully maintained systems could unravel with remarkable speed. Merchants might avoid dangerous waters, alter familiar routes, or disappear altogether as once secure harbors became uncertain. Around the end of the Bronze Age, this interconnected world experienced one of history's most dramatic transformations. Several major kingdoms declined or collapsed within a relatively short period. Trade networks weakened. Cities were abandoned. Royal archives fell silent. The movement of goods that had linked civilizations for centuries became increasingly fragmented. Historians continue to debate the causes, pointing toward combinations of climate change, warfare, migration, economic disruption, and natural disasters. For the merchant fleets, these changes may have proved devastating. Ships that once followed predictable commercial routes suddenly entered a world where familiar ports no longer functioned. Experienced navigators may have encountered hostile coastlines, damaged harbors, or communities unable to provide food and repairs. Entire trading expeditions could disappear without leaving any written record of their fate. Some of the most intriguing evidence comes from the sea itself. Marine archaeologists continue discovering isolated cargoes resting far from known harbors. Stone anchors appear where no permanent settlements have yet been identified. Amphorae emerge from depths suggesting ancient routes that differ from those traditionally reconstructed. Every underwater survey expands the map of Bronze Age navigation while simultaneously revealing how incomplete current knowledge remains. Could important shipping lanes still lie undiscovered beneath modern waters? It is entirely possible. Much of the Mediterranean seabed has never been systematically explored. Advances in sonar mapping, remotely operated vehicles, and deep-water archaeology have begun revealing sites once considered inaccessible. Each new expedition uncovers shipwrecks that remained hidden for thousands of years, often preserved in extraordinary condition beneath layers of sediment. The ships themselves carried more than cargo. They transported languages, artistic traditions, religious ideas, technological innovations, and diplomatic messages. Every voyage represented a thread connecting distant cultures. When one vessel disappeared, it may have carried far more than commercial goods. It may also have carried knowledge that never reached its destination, altering history in ways impossible to measure. Some researchers have suggested that numerous wrecks remain buried beneath ancient harbor sediments rather than open water. Others believe powerful earthquakes and changing coastlines submerged entire ports where damaged merchant vessels still rest beneath modern cities or offshore deposits. There are even proposals that undiscovered underwater anchorages may preserve fleets lost during sudden storms or regional conflicts. Although these ideas remain speculative, recent discoveries continue demonstrating that the Mediterranean still conceals remarkable archaeological treasures beneath its surface. The disappearance of so many merchant fleets also raises a quieter question. How many sailors completed extraordinary journeys without ever being remembered? Ancient inscriptions usually celebrate kings, generals, and monumental construction. Merchants and navigators rarely received the same attention, despite sustaining the trade networks upon which civilizations depended. Countless captains crossed dangerous seas guided only by memory, stars, and changing winds. Many reached home safely. Others vanished beyond the horizon, leaving no names behind, only scattered cargo resting silently on the ocean floor. Today, the Mediterranean continues to conceal much of its ancient past beneath calm blue waters. Fishing boats pass above wrecks whose timbers have not seen daylight since the Bronze Age. Coral slowly covers bronze ingots once destined for distant workshops. Amphorae remain arranged exactly as sailors secured them thousands of years ago before disaster interrupted their voyage. Somewhere in those unexplored depths, entire fleets may still rest together, preserving cargoes, personal belongings, navigational equipment, and perhaps even written records capable of revealing forgotten trade routes and long-lost destinations. Until those silent ships are found, the Eastern Mediterranean will continue guarding one of the greatest maritime mysteries of the ancient world, inviting us to wonder how many stories remain hidden beneath the waves. The merchant ships that vanished beneath the Eastern Mediterranean were more than isolated tragedies. Each missing vessel represented another thread in a vast web that connected kingdoms separated by hundreds of miles. As those threads gradually broke, something even greater began to unravel. Ports that had once welcomed distant sails fell unusually quiet. Royal storehouses emptied, and one of history's most sophisticated international systems slowly dissolved, leaving behind a mystery that continues to puzzle scholars to this day. Along the windswept coastline of the Eastern Mediterranean, abandoned harbors still face the sea. Stone quays, once crowded with sailors speaking different languages, now rest beneath layers of sediment and broken masonry. Inland, the ruins of once prosperous cities preserve warehouses where imported goods were carefully stored before being distributed across continents. Fragments of Cypriot copper ingots, Mycenaean pottery, Egyptian scarabs, Canaanite jars, and finely crafted glass beads appear together in archaeological excavations, silent reminders of a world whose economies were deeply connected. For centuries, these trade routes formed the lifeblood of the Bronze Age. Copper mined on Cyprus traveled to workshops across the Eastern Mediterranean. Tin arrived from distant and still debated sources, allowing craftsmen to produce bronze for weapons, farming tools, ceremonial objects, and monumental construction. Timber from the forests of Lebanon supplied shipbuilders and palace architects. Gold, ivory, Perfumes, textiles, precious stones, and exotic animals crossed both land and sea through carefully maintained commercial networks. No civilization stood entirely alone. Egypt relied upon imported raw materials unavailable along the Nile. The Hittite kingdom exchanged metals, horses, and manufactured goods with neighboring states. The Minoans and later the Mycenaeans prospered through maritime commerce, while Canaanite ports acted as vital intermediaries linking distant kingdoms. Diplomacy and trade became inseparable. Kings exchanged luxurious gifts alongside official treaties, strengthening political alliances through commercial relationships that benefited entire regions. Then, during the closing centuries of the Bronze Age, these connections began to weaken. The process appears almost unsettling in its gradual nature. Archaeological layers reveal fewer imported goods arriving in cities that had once depended upon international commerce. Luxury items became increasingly rare. Standardized manufacturing declined. Long-distance exchange slowed, while once busy ports handled fewer foreign products than they had for generations. It was not a single moment of collapse. It was a silence that spread from one harbor to another. The reasons remain among the greatest mysteries of ancient history. One widely accepted explanation points toward environmental change. Scientific studies suggest that parts of the eastern Mediterranean experienced prolonged drought during the late 2nd millennium BC. Reduced rainfall affected agriculture across several regions, limiting food production and placing enormous pressure upon both rural communities and expanding urban populations. Crops failed, livestock suffered, and governments found themselves managing shortages that weakened political stability. Climate alone, however, may not explain the scale of the transformation. Written records from several civilizations describe periods of conflict during the same era. Internal rebellions, regional warfare, and struggles for succession disrupted governments that had previously maintained stable trade routes. Merchant caravans and cargo ships depended upon predictable political conditions. As kingdoms became increasingly unstable, commercial confidence may have deteriorated alongside diplomatic relationships. Some historians emphasize the remarkable complexity of the Bronze Age economy itself. Far from being isolated kingdoms, these civilizations formed an interconnected system remarkably similar in certain respects to modern global trade. Raw materials originated in one region, manufacturing occurred in another, while finished goods traveled onward to distant consumers. Such interconnected systems often function efficiently during periods of stability, but become vulnerable when multiple disruptions occur simultaneously. If one important supplier failed, others soon experienced consequences. If maritime routes became unsafe, inland production slowed. If governments weakened, merchants faced increasing uncertainty. Instead of one dramatic catastrophe, the collapse may have resulted from numerous interconnected failures unfolding over several decades. Evidence from archaeology appears to support this possibility. Cities rarely declined in identical ways. Some were destroyed violently. Others experienced gradual depopulation. Several continued functioning, but on a much smaller scale. Trade did not disappear entirely, yet its scale and organization changed dramatically. Local production increasingly replaced imported goods, while international exchange became less reliable than it had been during previous centuries. Among the most intriguing mysteries is the disappearance of tin. Copper remained relatively abundant throughout much of the eastern Mediterranean, but bronze required both copper and tin. Archaeological evidence suggests that supplies of tin became increasingly difficult to obtain during the Late Bronze Age. Because the primary sources of ancient tin remain only partially understood, historians continue debating how disruptions along distant trade routes affected workshops thousands of miles away. Without sufficient tin, entire industries faced profound challenges. Bronze production slowed, military equipment became harder to replace, agricultural tools became less available. the effects rippled across societies that depended upon reliable access to essential materials. Then there is the enduring mystery of the so-called Sea Peoples. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions describe maritime groups attacking coastal regions during this turbulent period. Their exact identity remains one of history's most debated questions. Were they organized invaders, displaced refugees, opportunistic raiders, or a combination of many different populations responding to widespread instability? Most scholars believe the answer is more complex than any single explanation. Whatever their origins, they likely formed only one part of a much broader regional transformation rather than serving as its sole cause. Earthquakes may also have played a role. Several important Bronze Age cities occupy seismically active regions. Archaeological evidence at certain sites reveals destruction consistent with powerful earthquakes. Damaged ports, collapsed palaces, and disrupted infrastructure could have interrupted trade long before repairs became possible. Yet earthquakes alone cannot explain the coordinated decline observed across such an enormous geographical area. The written records themselves become increasingly quiet. Royal correspondence preserved in surviving archives reveals growing concern over shortages, military threats, and diplomatic tensions. Some letters request emergency shipments of grain. Others describe hostile conditions disrupting travel. Then, in many places, the archives simply end. Administrative systems that had recorded daily commerce for centuries suddenly fell silent, leaving historians with only fragments of the story. More speculative theories naturally emerge from such profound uncertainty. Some researchers have proposed that epidemic disease weakened populations before political systems collapsed, although direct archaeological evidence remains limited. Others suggest that unexplored shipwrecks resting beneath the Mediterranean preserve cargoes capable of revealing how trade routes changed during these final decades. A few even wonder whether undiscovered archives remain buried beneath destroyed palaces, containing diplomatic correspondence that could explain why prosperous kingdoms gradually lost contact with one another. While none of these ideas has been confirmed, each reflects how incomplete the surviving evidence remains. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not that civilizations experienced decline. History has witnessed many collapses. The remarkable question is how rapidly such a vast and interconnected world lost the systems that had supported it for centuries. Cities continued to exist. People adapted. New cultures eventually emerged. Yet the intricate commercial network linking Egypt, the Aegean, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant was never fully restored in quite the same form. Today, fragments of imported pottery continue to appear in archaeological excavations hundreds of miles from where they were created. Copper ingots rest upon ancient shipwrecks that never reached their destinations. Empty harbors still overlook the sea that once carried merchants between kingdoms, now remembered only through ruins. Somewhere beneath collapsed palaces, submerged ports, or unopened archives, the missing pieces of this extraordinary puzzle may still survive, waiting to reveal how one of humanity's earliest international economies slipped almost silently into history, leaving behind echoes that continue to fascinate those who search for its forgotten story. The quiet collapse of the Bronze Age trade networks reminds us that history often loses more than cities and kingdoms. Sometimes it loses names, family lines, and the people who were expected to shape the future. Few places illustrate this mystery more clearly than ancient Egypt during the 18th dynasty, where some of the most powerful rulers in history left behind monuments that have survived for thousands of years, while several of their own royal heirs seem to have disappeared almost without explanation. The first rays of sunlight spread across the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, illuminating entrances carved deep into the limestone mountains of western Thebes. Hidden beneath the desert floor are richly decorated tombs whose walls still preserve scenes of divine journeys, sacred rituals, and promises of eternal life. Nearby, The immense temples of Karnak and Luxor continue to dominate the landscape, their towering columns and colossal statues proclaiming the glory of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. Yet despite the grandeur surrounding them, some members of the royal family appear to have slipped almost completely from the historical record. The 18th dynasty, beginning around 1550 BC, marked one of the most successful periods in Egyptian history. Following the expulsion of the Hyksos, Egypt expanded into a powerful empire stretching across Nubia and much of the ancient Near East. Pharaohs such as Ahmose I, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun became associated with military victories, monumental architecture, religious transformation, and extraordinary wealth. One might expect that the children destined to inherit such an empire would be carefully documented. Instead, the surviving evidence often raises more questions than answers. Egyptian inscriptions celebrate kings with remarkable detail, recording military campaigns, temple construction, religious ceremonies, and royal achievements. Yet, information concerning many princes and princesses remains surprisingly limited. Some heirs appear briefly within inscriptions before disappearing entirely. Others are mentioned only once, leaving historians uncertain whether they died young, fell from political favor, or simply vanished into gaps within the archaeological record. One of the earliest examples involves the family of Amenhotep III. His reign represented the height of Egyptian prosperity, and numerous royal children are known through inscriptions, statues, and palace decorations. Yet determining which prince stood closest to the throne remains surprisingly difficult. Several sons appear to have died before reaching adulthood, while others vanish without clear explanation. The eventual succession by Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten, suggests that earlier heirs either died unexpectedly or became unable to rule. The reasons remain uncertain. Disease presents one possibility. Ancient Egypt, despite its sophistication, remained vulnerable to childhood illness, infections, and epidemics. Royal status offered no complete protection against disease. Infant mortality remained high throughout the ancient world, even among privileged families with access to the finest medical knowledge available. Yet the silence surrounding some royal heirs feels unusual. Egyptian rulers generally commemorated deceased family members through inscriptions, statues, or funerary monuments. Why then do certain individuals disappear almost completely? Political circumstances may provide part of the answer. Royal succession during the 18th dynasty was not always straightforward. Multiple wives, numerous children, and complex court relationships created competing claims to the throne. Princes who lost political support may have been deliberately omitted from later monuments. Their names could fade not because they never existed, but because later rulers preferred different versions of dynastic history. This practice was not unknown in ancient Egypt. Official inscriptions frequently emphasized legitimacy while minimizing inconvenient events. Successful rulers often presented orderly transitions of power, even when reality had been considerably more complicated. Perhaps no period illustrates this more dramatically than the Amarna age. When Akhenaten introduced his sweeping religious reforms centered upon the worship of the Aten, Egypt experienced one of its most extraordinary cultural transformations. The royal court relocated to a newly constructed capital, while traditional temples lost much of their influence. Within this rapidly changing political environment, several royal children appear in artistic scenes and inscriptions. Then the record grows increasingly uncertain. Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6 well-known daughters, yet evidence concerning possible sons remains limited and heavily debated. Some scholars have suggested that additional royal children may have existed, but were never clearly identified within surviving monuments. Others point to damaged inscriptions whose missing sections could once have contained names now permanently lost. The reign of Tutankhamun introduces another layer of mystery. The young pharaoh died around the age of 19, leaving no confirmed surviving heir. Excavations within his tomb uncovered the tiny mummified remains of 2 infant daughters, both apparently stillborn or dying shortly after birth. Their discovery provides a deeply personal glimpse into the royal family's private tragedy. Had either child survived, Egyptian history might have unfolded very differently. Instead, Tutankhamun's death without a living successor created a succession crisis that eventually elevated and later Horemheb to the throne. Even Horemheb contributes to the mystery. Although he became one of Egypt's most influential rulers, no confirmed biological heir inherited his position. Instead, power ultimately passed to Ramesses I, marking the beginning of the 19th dynasty. The transition appears orderly in retrospect, yet historians continue debating how many potential claimants disappeared from the historical record during these politically sensitive years. The archaeological evidence itself presents additional puzzles. Royal tombs intended for certain princes remain unfinished or unidentified. Funerary equipment prepared for individuals who never occupied the throne occasionally appears reused by later rulers. Names carved into monuments were sometimes erased, altered, or replaced, making reconstruction exceptionally difficult. Every damaged inscription introduces another uncertainty into the royal genealogy. The role of disease remains an important area of investigation. Modern examinations of royal mummies have revealed evidence of genetic disorders, infections, malaria, and other medical conditions affecting members of the royal family. While these discoveries explain some premature deaths, they cannot account for every missing heir. Nor do they explain why certain individuals seem to disappear almost entirely from official records. More speculative possibilities naturally emerge from these gaps. Some researchers wonder whether undiscovered tombs within the Valley of the Kings still contain the burials of forgotten princes whose identities have yet to be recognized. Others suggest that political rivalries following unexpected deaths may have resulted in deliberate historical suppression, leaving only scattered clues across damaged monuments and fragmentary inscriptions. A few have proposed that sealed archives beneath ancient temples or administrative buildings may preserve correspondence capable of clarifying disputed lines of succession. Although none of these possibilities has been confirmed, each reflects how much of Egypt's royal history remains incomplete despite centuries of archaeological exploration. The remarkable irony is impossible to ignore. The 18th dynasty produced some of the most recognizable rulers in human history. Their temples continue to dominate the Nile Valley. Their statues stand beneath open skies. Their tombs attract scholars from every corner of the world. Yet within these celebrated royal families remain children whose lives ended before history could fully remember them. Heirs who may once have been expected to rule an empire, but whose stories survive only in fragments of stone, faded paint, and broken inscriptions. Today, the corridors of the Valley of the Kings remain cool and silent beneath the desert mountains. Every newly discovered chamber, every restored relief, and every deciphered inscription carries the possibility of revealing another forgotten member of Egypt's royal household. Somewhere beneath untouched rock, behind an unexcavated doorway, or within a damaged inscription awaiting fresh analysis, the identities of these missing heirs may still endure, preserving the final pieces of a dynastic puzzle that has remained incomplete for more than 3,000 years. The forgotten royal heirs of Egypt remind us that history can lose not only individuals, but also the relationships that once connected entire civilizations. Behind every marriage arranged between royal families, every exchanged gift, and every carefully written treaty stood a fragile network of trust that stretched across the ancient world. For centuries, these diplomatic bonds helped maintain peace among powerful kingdoms. Then, almost without warning, many of those connections faded into silence, leaving historians to wonder how an international system that had endured for generations could disappear so completely. Inside the ruins of an ancient palace, broken clay tablets lie scattered across a stone floor. Their surfaces are covered with tiny wedge-shaped symbols pressed into wet clay more than 3,000 years ago. Some remain cracked by fire, others chipped by collapsing walls, yet many still preserve the voices of kings who once addressed one another as equals. They speak of friendship, marriage, precious gifts, military assistance, and promises of loyalty. Together, these humble tablets reveal that the Bronze Age world was far more connected than its vast distances might suggest. Long before modern diplomacy, the great kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean and the ancient Near East had already developed a sophisticated international system. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mitanni, Babylonia, Assyria, Alashiya on Cyprus, and powerful city-states throughout the Levant maintained regular communication through official messengers. Royal letters traveled across deserts, mountains, and seas, carried by trusted envoys who represented the highest authority of their rulers. These communications discussed trade, border disputes, succession, military cooperation, and carefully negotiated marriages designed to strengthen political alliances. Among the greatest discoveries illuminating this remarkable network are the Amarna letters. Found at the site of Akhetaten, the capital established by Akhenaten, these clay tablets preserve diplomatic correspondence exchanged during the 14th century BC. Written primarily in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, they reveal rulers addressing one another as brother, exchanging luxurious gifts while carefully protecting their own prestige. The letters are surprisingly personal. Kings complain when promised gold arrives in insufficient quantities. They request skilled craftsmen, physicians, horses, and rare materials. Royal daughters travel abroad to become queens in distant courts, strengthening alliances through marriage. Beneath the formal language lies an international community whose members understood one another remarkably well despite vast geographical separation. For a time, the system functioned with impressive stability. Diplomatic marriages reduced conflict. Trade supported mutual prosperity. Correspondence resolved disputes before they developed into open warfare. Yet by the closing centuries of the Bronze Age, these familiar exchanges became increasingly rare. One of the most striking features of the archaeological record is not simply the destruction of certain kingdoms, but the disappearance of the correspondence itself. Royal archives that once received letters from neighboring rulers suddenly fall silent. Palace libraries cease expanding. Diplomatic records stop almost entirely. In some cases, entire capitals were abandoned, leaving unfinished documents exactly where scribes had last handled them. What interrupted conversations that had continued for generations? Political instability provides one important explanation. Several major kingdoms experienced succession crises, internal rebellions, or external conflicts during the Late Bronze Age. Governments preoccupied with domestic survival naturally devoted fewer resources to maintaining distant diplomatic relationships. Royal messengers traveling between unstable regions faced increasing danger, while established communication routes became less reliable. Economic pressures likely compounded these difficulties. Diplomatic exchanges depended upon prosperous economies capable of supporting generous gifts and expensive marriage arrangements. Gold, silver, ivory, textiles, exotic animals, and luxury goods reinforced political friendships. As long-distance trade weakened, maintaining these prestigious exchanges became increasingly difficult. A kingdom struggling with food shortages or military threats could hardly prioritize elaborate diplomatic ceremonies. Climate may also have contributed. Evidence from lake sediments, pollen analysis, and other environmental studies suggests that prolonged drought affected parts of the eastern Mediterranean during the late 2nd millennium BC. Agricultural production declined in several regions, placing enormous strain upon governments responsible for feeding growing populations. Scarcity often reshapes political priorities, transforming trusted allies into competitors for increasingly limited resources. Even so, environmental stress alone cannot explain every disappearance. The remarkable treaty concluded between Egypt and the Hittite Empire following the Battle of Kadesh demonstrates the sophistication of Bronze Age diplomacy. It established mutual defense agreements, procedures for returning fugitives, and formal commitments to peaceful cooperation. Copies of the treaty survive in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, representing one of history's earliest known international peace agreements. Yet only decades later, the political landscape had changed dramatically. The Hittite Empire collapsed. Several Canaanite cities declined or were abandoned. Mycenaean palace centers fell silent. Egypt withdrew from many of its overseas territories. The diplomatic framework connecting these powers dissolved alongside them. One particularly intriguing mystery concerns the final messages exchanged between rulers during this turbulent period. Several surviving letters reveal growing anxiety. Kings request urgent military assistance. Governors report hostile forces approaching their cities. Officials plead for grain shipments to relieve famine conditions. The tone becomes increasingly desperate, suggesting that the international system remained active even as it struggled against mounting pressures. Then, quite suddenly, many archives end. Were additional letters written but never delivered? Did royal messengers disappear while traveling through dangerous territory? Could unopened archives still lie buried beneath destroyed palaces, preserving the final diplomatic conversations of the Bronze Age? The archaeological record cannot yet answer. Some regions present especially puzzling gaps. Powerful kingdoms that had exchanged correspondence for generations vanish from surviving diplomatic records without clear explanation. Certain rulers mentioned frequently within one generation disappear entirely from the next. Historians cannot always determine whether these absences reflect political collapse, lost archives, or discoveries that have yet to be made. The role of communication itself deserves careful consideration. Diplomatic systems depend upon trust, predictability, and reliable information. If merchants ceased traveling safely, royal messengers likely faced similar obstacles. Delayed correspondence could produce misunderstandings. Alliances might weaken simply because kingdoms could no longer communicate efficiently enough to coordinate responses to shared crises. More speculative possibilities naturally emerge from these unanswered questions. Some researchers have suggested that undiscovered palace archives remain buried beneath later settlements, preserving thousands of diplomatic tablets still awaiting excavation. Others wonder whether merchant ships resting beneath the Mediterranean carried official correspondence that never reached its destination after being lost at sea. A few have even proposed that the collapse of diplomatic relationships accelerated regional instability far more than currently recognized, creating a chain reaction that spread from one kingdom to another. Although these ideas remain unconfirmed, each reflects the extraordinary complexity of the ancient international world. Perhaps the most remarkable lesson is how modern these ancient relationships appear. The rulers of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Babylonia, Assyria, Mitanni, Al-Ashia, and the city-states of the Levant negotiated alliances, resolved disputes, exchanged ambassadors, and balanced competing interests in ways that feel surprisingly familiar today. Their world was connected not only through commerce, but also through diplomacy, mutual dependence, and carefully cultivated trust. Then the correspondence ceased. Today, museum collections preserve thousands of clay tablets whose tiny impressions continue speaking across more than 3,000 years. They record greetings exchanged between kings who expected their alliances to endure, agreements believed to guarantee stability, and friendships carefully maintained across continents. Yet somewhere beneath collapsed palaces, unexplored archives, or shipwrecks hidden beneath the Mediterranean, the missing letters may still exist. They may contain the final conversations between the great Bronze Age kingdoms, revealing how one of humanity's earliest international diplomatic systems gradually faded into silence, leaving behind questions that have endured almost as long as the civilizations themselves. The fading voices of Bronze Age diplomacy remind us that not every mystery is buried beneath ruined cities or forgotten archives. Some survive through stories whispered across generations, growing more powerful each time they are retold. In Egypt, where kings built monuments meant to endure forever, another kind of mystery emerged alongside the stone itself. It was not the mystery of vanished kingdoms, but of ancient warnings, sacred protection, and the enduring belief that disturbing a royal resting place could awaken forces beyond human understanding. As the first light of dawn reaches the desert plateau, long shadows stretch across weathered pyramids and silent mastabas standing above the western bank of the Nile. The limestone glows with a warm golden hue, while narrow entrances disappear into darkness beneath the earth. Deep inside these ancient structures, painted chambers preserve scenes of offerings, sacred ceremonies, and eternal journeys carefully prepared more than 4,000 years ago. Every carved inscription, sealed passage, and hidden burial chamber reflects a civilization that viewed death not as an ending, but as the beginning of another existence. For Egypt's earliest royal families, preserving that journey was a sacred responsibility. From the early dynastic period through the Old Kingdom, enormous effort was devoted to protecting royal burials. Massive stone architecture replaced earlier mud brick tombs. Hidden chambers concealed the bodies of kings beneath layers of carefully designed defenses. Valuable objects accompanied the deceased into eternity, while priests performed elaborate rituals intended to preserve both body and spirit forever. Modern imagination often associates these tombs with dramatic curses. Yet the historical reality is more subtle and, in many ways, even more intriguing. Contrary to popular legend, explicit written curses threatening supernatural punishment are surprisingly uncommon within the royal tombs of Egypt. Most funerary inscriptions focus instead upon prayers, offerings, divine protection, and the continuation of eternal life. Rather than frightening future intruders through elaborate warnings, they sought to ensure that proper rituals would continue for the benefit of the deceased. Even so, ancient Egyptians clearly believed that tombs possessed profound spiritual significance. Many non-royal tombs contain inscriptions warning against those who might damage burial sites or interfere with funerary offerings. These texts sometimes invoke divine judgment, declaring that anyone disturbing the tomb would answer before powerful deities or lose the blessings of the afterlife. Such statements functioned both as religious declarations and practical deterrents against grave robbers. Royal burials carried even greater symbolic importance. The pharaoh was not merely a political ruler. He served as the intermediary between humanity and the divine order known as Ma'at, representing harmony, justice, and cosmic balance. Violating a king's burial therefore carried consequences extending far beyond ordinary theft. It threatened the sacred relationship between the living, the dead, and the gods themselves. Perhaps this belief laid the foundation for later legends. Throughout Egyptian history, tomb robbery remained a persistent problem despite elaborate security measures. Ancient judicial records reveal investigations into stolen royal treasures, trials of tomb robbers, and confessions describing carefully planned raids into burial chambers. Even in antiquity, many royal tombs were opened long before modern archaeologists arrived. Yet despite these violations, stories gradually emerged suggesting that some resting places resisted intrusion in unexpected ways. The best-known examples belong to much later discoveries, particularly the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb during the 20th century. A series of unrelated illnesses and deaths affecting several individuals connected with the excavation gave rise to sensational reports describing the so-called curse of the pharaohs. Newspapers around the world transformed coincidence into compelling narrative, creating one of archaeology's most enduring legends. But what of Egypt's earliest royal families? Did similar beliefs exist long before modern headlines captured the public imagination? Archaeological evidence suggests that ancient Egyptians certainly viewed tombs as spiritually protected places. Ritual objects buried alongside kings were believed to possess sacred functions. Statues could serve as vessels through which the deceased received offerings. Carefully spoken funerary rituals maintained the individual's existence within the afterlife. Every aspect of burial reflected the conviction that unseen forces continued operating beyond physical death. Disturbing such carefully prepared environments may have carried psychological consequences even for ancient visitors. Priests entering burial chambers during official ceremonies likely approached these spaces with profound reverence. Tomb robbers, aware of religious beliefs surrounding the dead, may have experienced intense fear while violating sacred sites. In societies where divine punishment formed part of everyday understanding, the expectation of supernatural consequences could itself become a powerful influence upon human behavior. The architecture reinforces this atmosphere. Long descending corridors, sealed stone doors, hidden chambers, narrow passageways, and painted walls depicting divine judgment combine to create environments unlike ordinary buildings. The silence within these spaces is striking. Air grows noticeably cooler. Sound becomes muted. Even today, visitors often describe a powerful emotional response while standing inside ancient royal tombs. Is that feeling simply the weight of history? Or does it reflect the extraordinary care with which these sacred places were designed? Several early royal tombs continue presenting unanswered questions. Some burial sites appear intentionally concealed beyond what practical security alone would require. Others contain unusual architectural features whose symbolic purpose remains uncertain. Certain royal graves were carefully emptied and reburied during later dynasties in efforts to protect the mummies from increasingly frequent theft. These deliberate relocations complicate the archaeological record, while adding another layer of mystery surrounding the fate of Egypt's earliest rulers. The absence of complete evidence leaves room for interpretation. Some historians believe that later curse legends grew gradually from genuine religious beliefs concerning sacred space and divine justice. Others argue that modern fascination with supernatural punishment has overshadowed the more complex spiritual worldview of ancient Egypt. Rather than envisioning dramatic magical retaliation, Egyptians may have understood consequences in terms of cosmic balance, moral responsibility, and judgment within the afterlife. Yet folklore rarely remains confined to historical documents. For centuries, local traditions surrounding ancient ruins preserved stories of restless spirits, hidden guardians, and forbidden places best left undisturbed. Travelers recorded accounts of mysterious lights appearing near burial grounds, strange sounds echoing from abandoned tombs, and inexplicable misfortunes affecting those who ignored ancient warnings. Such stories cannot be verified through archaeology, yet they reveal how deeply these monuments continued shaping cultural memory long after the civilizations that built them had disappeared. More speculative ideas naturally emerge from this enduring fascination. Some researchers have suggested that certain sealed tomb environments may once have contained naturally occurring molds or bacteria capable of affecting later intruders, providing a possible explanation for occasional reports of illness associated with ancient burials. Others wonder whether undiscovered ritual texts remain hidden within unopened chambers, preserving religious formulas intended to invoke divine protection over royal graves. A few propose that many stories of curses represent echoes of ancient oral traditions that were never committed to writing, but survived through generations of priests and local communities. While none of these possibilities can fully explain every legend, they demonstrate how history and mythology often become intertwined. Today, Egypt's earliest royal cemeteries remain remarkably quiet beneath the desert sun. The pyramids continue rising above the horizon with timeless certainty, while older tombs lie concealed beneath shifting sands, their chambers still guarding objects untouched for thousands of years. Every newly discovered burial invites not only archaeological investigation, but also renewed questions about the beliefs of those who built these extraordinary monuments. Somewhere behind an unopened stone doorway, beneath an unexcavated mastaba, or within inscriptions too weathered to read completely, another forgotten chapter of Egypt's oldest royal traditions may still survive, waiting to reveal whether the legends of sacred protection began not with later imagination, but with beliefs that the ancient Egyptians themselves quietly carried into eternity. The enduring legends surrounding Egypt's royal tombs remind us that history often preserves the memory of powerful kingdoms while quietly allowing smaller worlds to fade into obscurity. Beyond the towering pyramids and imperial capitals lay dozens of modest city-states that once flourished along the eastern Mediterranean. They traded with great empires, welcomed foreign envoys, and guarded important crossroads. Then, over the course of a turbulent age, many of them disappeared so completely that only fragments of walls and scattered pottery now hint that they ever existed. At sunrise, the rolling hills of the southern Levant cast long shadows across weathered stone foundations. Low mounds rise gently from the landscape, their grassy surfaces concealing layer upon layer of forgotten settlements. Broken defensive walls emerge from the soil, interrupted by collapsed gateways that once controlled the movement of merchants, soldiers, and travelers. Scattered pottery glitters beneath the sunlight, while ancient wells and abandoned storehouses silently mark places that were once alive with conversation, commerce, and ceremony. Unlike the monumental capitals of Egypt or the vast fortresses of the Hittite Empire, many of these settlements were comparatively small, yet their importance far exceeded their size. Positioned along caravan routes linking Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean coast, these city-states formed the connective tissue of the Bronze Age world. Merchants rested within their walls before continuing long journeys. Diplomats exchanged messages in their palaces. Farmers supplied grain to passing caravans, while local craftsmen produced ceramics, textiles, bronze tools, and luxury goods destined for distant markets. Many functioned as independent kingdoms. Others acknowledged the authority of larger empires while retaining considerable local autonomy. Their rulers negotiated alliances, paid tribute when necessary, and carefully balanced the competing ambitions of more powerful neighbors. Their survival depended not upon military strength alone, but upon diplomacy, commerce, and adaptability. For centuries, this delicate balance endured. Egyptian records describe loyal governors administering cities throughout Palestine. Hittite archives mention negotiations with regional rulers. The Amarna letters preserve appeals for military assistance, reports of political unrest, and correspondence between local kings seeking support from Egypt during times of uncertainty. These documents reveal a remarkably interconnected political landscape. Dozens of rulers governed relatively modest territories, yet together they maintained a network essential to the functioning of the broader Bronze Age economy. Every city contributed to regional stability in ways that larger empires often depended upon without fully controlling. Then, during the closing centuries of the Bronze Age, many of these settlements entered a period of profound uncertainty. Some archaeological sites reveal unmistakable evidence of violent destruction. Burned buildings, collapsed fortifications, abandoned streets, and scattered weapons suggest sudden attacks or prolonged conflict. Other cities display a very different pattern. Construction simply slows. Imported goods become increasingly rare. Public buildings receive fewer repairs. Population gradually declines until entire neighborhoods stand empty. The contrast is striking. Why were some settlements destroyed while others faded almost silently? One explanation points toward the widespread political instability affecting the Eastern Mediterranean during this period. As larger kingdoms struggled with warfare, succession disputes, economic pressures, and environmental challenges, smaller city-states found themselves increasingly vulnerable. Trade routes became less predictable, military protection weakened, long-standing alliances dissolved. Communities that had depended upon international commerce suddenly faced growing isolation. Climate may also have played a significant role. Scientific studies indicate that portions of the Eastern Mediterranean experienced extended periods of reduced rainfall near the end of the Bronze Age. Agriculture became more difficult in regions already dependent upon seasonal precipitation. Declining harvests affected both food supplies and local economies, encouraging migration toward more productive areas while placing additional strain upon vulnerable settlements. Yet the archaeological evidence rarely supports a single explanation. Some cities located only short distances apart experienced remarkably different outcomes. One settlement might be destroyed by fire, while another continued functioning for generations. Nearby communities sharing similar environments sometimes followed entirely separate historical paths. This uneven pattern remains one of archaeology's most intriguing puzzles. Among the most valuable sources illuminating these final decades are the Amarna letters. Several local rulers urgently requested military assistance from Egypt, reporting hostile neighbors, internal rebellions, and attacks by groups operating beyond established political authority. Their appeals convey growing anxiety rather than sudden catastrophe. They describe a landscape where traditional systems of order were already beginning to weaken. In many cases, the requested help either arrived too late or left no lasting trace within the historical record. Some cities simply vanish afterward. Excavations reveal another mystery. At numerous sites, valuable objects appear to have been left behind despite apparent abandonment. Storage jars remain inside buildings. Household tools lie where they were last used. Administrative seals, pottery, and everyday possessions suggest departures that were not always carefully planned. Yet, widespread evidence of hurried evacuation is equally absent in several locations. Did residents leave gradually? Were populations relocated by stronger kingdoms? Did survivors merge with neighboring communities whose identities eventually replaced older political traditions? The archaeological record offers possibilities but few certainties. Changing trade patterns likely contributed as well. As international commerce declined during the late Bronze Age, settlements positioned along former caravan routes lost much of their economic importance. Ports handling fewer merchant ships generated less wealth. Inland markets attracted fewer travelers. Communities built upon commercial exchange may have found themselves increasingly unable to sustain previous levels of prosperity. Natural disasters remain another possibility. Several regions within the Eastern Mediterranean lie along active seismic zones. Earthquakes capable of damaging fortifications, wells, irrigation systems, and public buildings undoubtedly occurred throughout antiquity. While certain archaeological layers reveal destruction compatible with seismic activity, no single earthquake can explain the disappearance of so many settlements spread across such a wide geographical area. More speculative interpretations continue attracting attention. Some researchers suggest that undocumented migrations transformed local populations without leaving clear written records. Others propose that unexplored archaeological sites may preserve administrative archives capable of revealing political decisions preceding abandonment. There are also theories that some lesser city-states intentionally merged under stronger regional powers to improve their chances of survival during increasingly unstable times. because surviving inscriptions remain fragmentary and excavation continues at many locations, these possibilities cannot yet be confirmed or dismissed. An equally fascinating mystery concerns memory itself. The great empires preserved extensive inscriptions celebrating victories, monumental architecture, and royal achievements. Smaller kingdoms rarely possessed comparable resources for recording their own histories. When their cities disappeared, their voices often vanished with them. Later, civilizations built upon their ruins, reused their stones, and forgot the names of rulers who had once governed thriving communities. Only archaeology gradually restores fragments of their existence. A broken seal bearing the name of an unknown governor. A storage jar imported from Cyprus. A damaged city wall rebuilt several times before finally being abandoned. Each discovery hints at lives once intertwined with the larger history of the Bronze Age, even if their individual stories remain incomplete. Today, countless ancient settlement mounds remain scattered across the landscapes of Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and southern Syria. Many have never been fully excavated. Beneath layers of earth lie forgotten streets, administrative buildings, workshops, temples, and homes waiting to reveal new chapters of a largely silent history. Somewhere within those untouched ruins may rest clay tablets, royal seals, or forgotten inscriptions capable of explaining why so many lesser city-states vanished while others endured. Until those discoveries emerge from the ground, these quiet settlements will continue guarding one of the Bronze Age's most enduring mysteries, reminding us that history is shaped not only by the rise and fall of mighty empires, but also by the countless smaller kingdoms whose stories almost disappeared from memory altogether. The forgotten city-states of the southern Levant remind us that entire communities can disappear, leaving behind little more than scattered stones and unanswered questions. Yet sometimes the greatest threat to an ancient civilization was not an invading army or a collapsing alliance. Sometimes it was something invisible, moving quietly from one settlement to another, leaving fear in its wake. Within the records of the Hittite Empire survives one of history's earliest accounts of a devastating epidemic, a mystery whose true nature remains elusive even after more than 3,000 years. High upon the rocky plateau of central Anatolia, the winds sweep through the ruined streets of Hatshepsut, once the magnificent capital of the Hittite Empire. Massive limestone walls still encircle the ancient city, interrupted by monumental gateways guarded by weathered stone lions and sphinxes. Beyond them lie the remains of royal palaces, administrative buildings, temples, and storehouses that once formed the heart of one of the greatest powers of the Bronze Age. Today, silence fills those abandoned avenues, broken only by the breeze moving through the grass that now covers what was once a thriving imperial capital. Among the thousands of clay tablets recovered from Hatshepsut are records unlike military reports or diplomatic treaties. They speak of suffering. They describe grief. They preserve the desperate words of a king searching for an explanation as his people continued to die. These remarkable documents, often known as the Plague Prayers of Mersili II, represent one of the earliest surviving historical accounts of an epidemic affecting an entire empire. According to the inscriptions, the plague endured for many years. Mersili II repeatedly appealed to the gods, asking why such relentless suffering had fallen upon the Hittite kingdom. His prayers reveal a ruler struggling not only with political responsibility, but with profound uncertainty. He searched royal archives, consulted priests, and reflected upon the actions of earlier kings, believing that somewhere within the past lay the cause of the disaster overwhelming his realm. The epidemic appears to have begun during the reign of his father, Suppiluliuma I. Suppiluliuma had transformed the Hittite kingdom into a dominant regional power through a series of successful military campaigns. Among his victories was the conquest of territories in northern Syria, where prisoners of war were reportedly brought back into Hittite lands. Some ancient sources suggest that these captives unknowingly carried disease. If true, the consequences proved catastrophic. The plague spread throughout the empire, reportedly claiming not only countless ordinary citizens but members of the royal family as well. Suppiluliuma himself is believed to have died from the epidemic, followed shortly afterward by his successor, Arnawanda II. Their deaths placed the young Mursili II upon the throne during one of the most challenging moments in Hittite history. Yet, despite the detailed descriptions preserved within the prayers, the true identity of the disease remains unknown. Modern historians and medical researchers have proposed numerous possibilities. Some suggest bubonic plague, although the available evidence remains insufficient to confirm this diagnosis. Others favor tularemia, smallpox, typhoid fever, or another infectious disease capable of spreading through military campaigns and trade routes. The surviving texts describe prolonged suffering, but provide too few clinical details to identify the illness with certainty. The mystery deepens because the epidemic appears unusually persistent. Rather than passing within months, the plague reportedly continued for nearly 2 decades. Such an extended crisis would have affected agriculture, military readiness, administration, trade, and public morale throughout the empire. Entire generations may have grown up knowing little except recurring illness and uncertainty. The Hittites sought explanations very different from those proposed today. For Mursili II, disease reflected divine displeasure. His prayers repeatedly question whether earlier rulers had violated sacred oaths, neglected religious duties, or committed acts that angered the gods. One recurring concern involved the actions of his father during military campaigns. Had prisoners been treated improperly? Had treaties been broken? Had sacred obligations been ignored? The king did not dismiss these possibilities. Instead, he ordered extensive religious ceremonies, offerings, and rituals intended to restore harmony between the kingdom and the divine powers believed to govern its fate. These tablets offer an extraordinary glimpse into the mindset of an ancient ruler confronting disaster. Unlike inscriptions celebrating victory or monumental construction, the plague prayers reveal vulnerability. They preserve doubt rather than certainty, portraying a king openly acknowledging that he did not understand why suffering continued despite repeated efforts to end it. Archaeology provides only limited assistance. Although excavations at Hattusa have uncovered extensive administrative archives, direct physical evidence identifying the epidemic remains scarce. Human remains from the period rarely preserve clear traces capable of revealing the exact pathogen responsible. Organic material deteriorates over millennia, while many infectious diseases leave little visible evidence upon skeletal remains. As a result, the written record remains our primary source. Trade networks may have played an important role. The Hittite Empire maintained extensive diplomatic and commercial connections with Egypt, Babylonia, Assyria, Cyprus, and numerous city-states throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Merchants, diplomats, soldiers, and travelers moved regularly between distant regions. These same routes that carried luxury goods and political messages may also have unintentionally transported disease across remarkable distances. If so, the epidemic highlights another hidden consequence of the interconnected Bronze Age world. Prosperity and vulnerability often traveled together. The timing also raises intriguing questions. The Hittite plague occurred during a period already marked by political rivalries, military expansion, and increasing international contact. Some historians wonder whether recurring epidemics weakened several Bronze Age societies before the wider regional disruptions that eventually contributed to the collapse of many interconnected kingdoms. Although disease alone cannot explain the broader transformation of the Late Bronze Age, it may have added another layer of instability to an already fragile world. More speculative ideas continue to emerge as researchers examine the surviving evidence. Some scholars have suggested that future advances in ancient DNA analysis may eventually identify pathogens preserved within carefully excavated human remains from Hittite cemeteries. Others wonder whether unopened archives at Hatshepsut or nearby settlements still contain administrative records documenting quarantine measures, mortality, or regional outbreaks that could clarify the epidemic's progression. There are even proposals that multiple diseases, rather than a single plague, affected the empire over successive years, creating the prolonged crisis described in the royal prayers. None of these possibilities has been confirmed, yet each reflects how much remains unknown about one of history's earliest recorded epidemics. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the mystery is its familiarity. Across thousands of years, the questions voiced by Mursili II remain strikingly recognizable. Where did the illness begin? Why did it spread so widely? Could it have been prevented? How does a civilization endure when an invisible enemy moves silently through its people? Today, the winds continue to pass through the abandoned gates of Hatshepsut, where thousands of clay tablets still preserve the fears of a king who searched desperately for answers. The temples where priests once offered prayers stand in ruins, while the archives continue yielding new fragments that slowly reshape our understanding of the Hittite world. Somewhere beneath the soil of Anatolia, within an unopened burial, a forgotten archive, or evidence not yet recognized by archaeology, the final clues to this ancient epidemic may still survive. Until then, the first recorded plague of the Hittite Empire remains suspended between history and mystery, reminding us that some of humanity's oldest questions about disease, fate, and survival have yet to receive their final answer. The unanswered questions surrounding the Hittite plague reveal how easily entire generations can fade into uncertainty. Disease can erase lives, but time can erase something even more fragile: the memory of those who once ruled. Throughout the ancient land of Canaan, powerful royal families governed thriving cities, forged alliances with mighty empires, and shaped the course of Bronze Age history. Yet many of those dynasties vanished so completely that even their names survive only as faint echoes carved into broken stone and weathered clay. As dawn spreads across the rolling hills of ancient Canaan, mist settles gently over low earthen mounds that conceal forgotten cities beneath their surface. Fragments of defensive walls emerge from the landscape, interrupted by collapsed gateways and worn foundations that once supported royal palaces. Olive trees grow where ceremonial courtyards once stood, while scattered pottery and broken seals lie buried beneath layers of earth, waiting for careful hands to uncover them once again. Unlike Egypt, where monumental temples proclaimed the achievements of generations of pharaohs, the kingdoms of Canaan were generally smaller and more decentralized. Their rulers governed individual city-states rather than vast empires. Each city possessed its own palace, its own ruling family, and its own political ambitions. Although they shared languages, cultural traditions, and commercial connections, they remained independent communities linked by diplomacy, trade, rivalry, and occasional warfare. Cities such as Hazor, Megiddo, Lachish, Gezer, Ashkelon, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and dozens of lesser-known settlements formed a complex political landscape stretching across the eastern Mediterranean. Their kings negotiated with Egypt, exchanged gifts with neighboring rulers, and maintained carefully balanced relationships with larger imperial powers. Yet surprisingly little is known about the families who governed them. Archaeology has revealed magnificent palaces, defensive fortifications, administrative buildings, temples, and luxury goods imported from distant kingdoms. Egyptian inscriptions occasionally preserve the names of local rulers, while the Amarna letters introduce us to governors pleading for military assistance or reporting regional conflicts. Then, in many cases, the record simply ends. Entire royal houses disappear. Unlike Egyptian dynasties, whose succession can often be reconstructed through monumental inscriptions and carefully preserved king lists, many Canaanite dynasties survive only through isolated references. A king may appear within a diplomatic letter or an Egyptian military inscription, only for his descendants to vanish entirely from the surviving historical record. Did these royal families die without heirs? Were they replaced by rival dynasties? Did political upheaval erase their identities from history? No definitive answer has yet emerged. Part of the mystery lies in the nature of Canaanite political organization. Unlike centralized empires, the region consisted of numerous independent kingdoms whose fortunes rose and fell according to shifting alliances, local rivalries, and the ambitions of neighboring powers. A successful dynasty might govern for generations before suddenly disappearing following invasion, rebellion, or internal succession disputes. Unfortunately, written records from the cities themselves remain relatively scarce. Many administrative archives were written on materials that have not survived the passage of time. Unlike the baked clay tablets preserved within Hittite or Mesopotamian archives, documents written on papyrus or parchment deteriorated rapidly under ordinary environmental conditions. As a result, countless royal genealogies may simply have vanished through natural decay rather than deliberate destruction. Even where inscriptions survive, they often provide only fragments of larger stories. A royal seal bearing an unfamiliar name, a dedication carved into a temple wall, a diplomatic letter mentioning a prince otherwise unknown to history. Each discovery offers another piece of an enormous puzzle whose overall picture remains incomplete. The Amarna letters provide some of the clearest glimpses into these forgotten dynasties. Written during the 14th century BC, they reveal local rulers governing cities throughout Palestine while corresponding with the Egyptian court. Many express concern over neighboring rivals, shifting alliances, and groups threatening regional stability. Their letters portray ambitious leaders attempting to preserve fragile kingdoms within an increasingly uncertain political landscape. Yet few of these rulers appear again in later sources. Some cities continued to exist. The dynasties themselves often did not. The widespread disruptions affecting the late Bronze Age likely played a significant role. As international trade weakened, diplomatic alliances dissolved, and powerful empires struggled with internal crises, smaller kingdoms faced mounting pressure. Military campaigns damaged urban centers. Population movements altered established political boundaries. Economic decline reduced the resources available to local rulers attempting to maintain authority. Under such conditions, dynasties could disappear remarkably quickly. A king might fall in battle. His heirs might perish through disease. A rival noble family could seize power. Foreign governors might replace local rulers altogether. Within only a generation or two, an entire royal lineage could vanish from memory. Archaeological excavations reveal subtle traces of these transitions. At several ancient sites, palace architecture changes noticeably following periods of destruction or abandonment. Administrative seals bearing one family name disappear, replaced by entirely different symbols or titles. Imported luxury goods become less common, while local styles begin reflecting new political realities. Such changes suggest shifts in authority, even when surviving texts remain silent. One particularly intriguing mystery concerns royal tombs. Compared with Egypt, relatively few clearly identified Canaanite royal burials have been discovered. Wealthy graves certainly exist, containing jewelry, weapons, imported ceramics, and luxury items appropriate for elite individuals. Yet securely identifying specific kings or dynasties often proves impossible. Without inscriptions naming the deceased, archaeologists can only speculate about the identities of those once laid to rest with such care. Where, then, are the founders of these forgotten kingdoms? Could their tombs remain hidden beneath unexplored sections of ancient cities? Or were many royal burials disturbed, reused, or destroyed during later centuries of conflict and rebuilding? The archaeological evidence cannot yet provide certainty. There is also the question of cultural continuity. Although political dynasties disappeared, many cities continued to be inhabited by later populations who reused earlier buildings, repaired ancient walls, and constructed new structures directly above older foundations. Layers accumulated across centuries, gradually concealing the physical evidence of earlier rulers beneath successive generations of occupation. History, in effect, buried itself. More speculative ideas naturally arise from these enduring mysteries. Some researchers believe that undiscovered archives beneath palace ruins may still preserve king lists, diplomatic correspondence, or administrative records capable of reconstructing forgotten royal genealogies. Others suggest that future advances in genetic analysis could eventually identify familial relationships among individuals buried within elite cemeteries, offering new insights into dynastic succession. There are also proposals that several unidentified seals and inscriptions already resting within museum collections belong to royal families whose historical significance has yet to be fully recognized. While none of these possibilities has been confirmed, they highlight how much remains concealed beneath both the earth and the existing archaeological record. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not that these dynasties disappeared. Political change is a constant throughout history. Rather, it is remarkable how thoroughly their identities faded despite governing cities that played important roles within the Bronze Age world. Their ambassadors negotiated with pharaohs. Their merchants traded across the Mediterranean. Their soldiers defended fortified walls. Their decisions influenced thousands of lives. Yet today, many of their names survive only in damaged inscriptions or isolated diplomatic letters whose incomplete lines leave more questions than answers. Across the ancient landscapes of Palestine, countless archaeological mounds still await excavation. Beneath their quiet surfaces rest palaces whose courtyards have not seen daylight for thousands of years, administrative buildings whose archives remain unopened, and burial chambers whose occupants are still unknown. Somewhere among those forgotten ruins may lie the missing records of Canaan's lost royal houses, preserving the names, families, and histories of rulers who once believed their dynasties would endure forever. Until those hidden chapters are uncovered, the vanished lineages of ancient Canaan will remain one of the most compelling mysteries of the Bronze Age, inviting us to wonder how many forgotten kings still sleep beneath the soil, their stories waiting patiently to be remembered. The forgotten kings of ancient Canaan remind us that history is often written by those whose records survive. Yet beyond the ruined palaces and abandoned capitals, another mystery drifted across the waters of the eastern Mediterranean. Long before kingdoms collapsed and royal dynasties disappeared, ancient scribes recorded unsettling encounters with unidentified raiders who emerged from the sea, struck without warning, and vanished once again beyond the horizon. Their identities remain one of the earliest unsolved maritime mysteries of the Bronze Age. As dawn breaks over the eastern Mediterranean, gentle waves wash against rugged shorelines carved by thousands of years of wind and water. Quiet coves lie hidden beneath steep cliffs, while narrow beaches stretch between rocky headlands that once served as natural harbors. Far offshore, the sea appears peaceful, reflecting the pale morning sky. Yet beneath that calm surface lies a maritime landscape that connected, and sometimes threatened, the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. For merchants, the sea offered opportunity. For explorers, it promised discovery. For others, it may have provided something entirely different. Throughout the Bronze Age, maritime trade linked Egypt, Crete, Cyprus, Anatolia, the Aegean Islands, and the coastal cities of Palestine and Syria. Merchant vessels carried copper, tin, timber, wine, olive oil, luxury textiles, precious stones, and diplomatic gifts across hundreds of miles of open water. These voyages depended upon stable sea routes and relatively predictable political conditions. Yet the surviving records occasionally hint at dangerous groups operating beyond the control of established kingdoms. Unlike organized imperial navies, these seaborne raiders appear only briefly within ancient inscriptions and administrative texts. Their names are often uncertain, their origins obscure, and their motives difficult to reconstruct. They emerge suddenly within the historical record, disrupt trade or attack coastal settlements, and then disappear almost as quickly as they arrived. One reason for this uncertainty is the fragmentary nature of the surviving evidence. Many Bronze Age texts describe hostile maritime groups without providing detailed descriptions of their identity. Egyptian inscriptions, Hittite records, and correspondence from coastal city-states sometimes refer to attacks by seaborne enemies or mention increasing insecurity along important trade routes. Unfortunately, these documents were usually written from the perspective of rulers concerned primarily with defending their own territories rather than preserving detailed ethnographic information about their opponents. As a result, historians often know more about the consequences of these encounters than about the raiders themselves. The famous Sea Peoples dominate discussions of the late Bronze Age collapse, particularly because Egyptian inscriptions from the reigns of Merneptah and Ramesses III describe major confrontations with maritime confederations. Yet evidence suggests that unidentified sea raiders may have troubled Mediterranean societies long before those famous battles occurred. Earlier records contain scattered clues. Some coastal communities strengthened defensive walls despite no evidence of immediate conflict with neighboring kingdoms. Others constructed watchtowers overlooking strategic harbors or relocated settlements to more defensible positions. Administrative correspondence occasionally expresses concern regarding the safety of maritime travel, while certain cargoes appear to have been transported under increasingly cautious conditions. Were these precautions responses to isolated incidents, or did they reflect a long-standing maritime threat that left only scattered traces within the surviving historical record? The archaeological evidence presents an equally intriguing picture. Several coastal settlements display destruction layers whose precise causes remain uncertain. In some cases, fire damaged important buildings without obvious evidence of prolonged siege warfare. Valuable goods appear to have been removed before destruction, while other sites preserve signs of hurried abandonment. Although natural disasters remain possible explanations at certain locations, maritime attacks cannot always be ruled out. Shipwrecks contribute another layer of mystery. Excavations beneath the Mediterranean have revealed merchant vessels carrying immense quantities of valuable cargo. Many sank during storms or navigational accidents, but not every wreck clearly reflects natural causes. Some archaeologists have wondered whether certain losses resulted from attacks at sea, where wooden ships disappeared without leaving written testimony of their final moments. If piracy existed on a significant scale, it would leave remarkably little direct evidence. Successful raiders seldom recorded their own activities. Their victims often never returned to report what had happened. The sea itself concealed the aftermath. Ancient geography may also have favored such groups. The eastern Mediterranean contains countless islands, hidden inlets, sheltered bays, and narrow channels capable of concealing small vessels from passing merchants. Experienced sailors familiar with local winds and currents could observe commercial traffic while remaining largely invisible from major shipping lanes. For communities dependent upon maritime commerce, this uncertainty created constant risk. The distinction between merchant, fisherman, private sailor, and raider may not always have been clear. During periods of economic hardship or political instability, coastal populations could have shifted between peaceful trade and opportunistic violence according to changing circumstances. Rather than belonging to permanent pirate kingdoms, some raiding groups may have formed temporarily before dispersing once conditions improved. This possibility complicates efforts to identify them archaeologically. Material culture recovered from coastal settlements rarely distinguishes peaceful merchants from occasional raiders. The same ships capable of transporting copper or olive oil might also carry armed crews prepared to seize vulnerable cargo if opportunity presented itself. Written sources occasionally describe rulers requesting additional naval protection or strengthening coastal defenses. Such measures suggest that maritime insecurity was taken seriously even when surviving inscriptions remain frustratingly brief. Trade itself may have contributed to the problem. The remarkable prosperity of the Bronze Age created enormous concentrations of wealth moving regularly across predictable routes. Merchant ships often transported cargoes whose value rivaled the treasuries of smaller kingdoms. Copper ingots, tin, gold, ivory, luxury ceramics, and exotic goods represented irresistible prizes for anyone capable of intercepting them far from the protection of coastal fortifications. As international commerce expanded, opportunities for maritime predation likely increased as well. More speculative interpretations naturally emerge from these unanswered questions. Some researchers propose that several groups later identified collectively as the Sea Peoples may have originated from smaller maritime communities that had been conducting raids for generations before entering recorded history on a larger scale. Others suggest that undiscovered shipwrecks resting beneath unexplored areas of the Mediterranean may preserve evidence of armed confrontations between merchant vessels and unidentified attackers. There are even theories that some supposed pirate raids actually reflected displaced coastal populations struggling to survive during periods of famine, environmental change, or political collapse rather than organized piracy in the modern sense. Although none of these possibilities has been conclusively demonstrated, each offers a different perspective on how ancient maritime violence may have developed. One of the greatest challenges facing historians is the silence itself. Empires preserved records celebrating victories over named enemies, yet lesser incidents often went unrecorded. A merchant vessel disappearing at sea might never appear within official archives. A small coastal settlement attacked by unknown raiders could vanish without leaving written testimony. Over centuries, countless isolated events may have accumulated into patterns now visible only through scattered archaeological clues. Today, the Eastern Mediterranean continues to guard many of its oldest secrets beneath calm blue waters. Ancient anchorages remain buried beneath layers of sediment, while unexplored shipwrecks rest in darkness far below the reach of sunlight. Coastal ruins still overlook the same sea that carried merchants, diplomats, explorers, and perhaps unidentified raiders whose names were never fully preserved. Somewhere beneath those waters, within forgotten harbor settlements or unopened archives, evidence may still survive that reveals who these mysterious seaborne attackers truly were. Until then, they remain shadowy figures at the edge of recorded history, appearing briefly in ancient memories before disappearing once more into the vast silence of the sea.